Chapter 8. The journey of the Duke and Sir Ambrose to London had nothing in it to distinguish it from hundreds of other journeys, and they did not meet with a single adventure worthy of being recorded. It happened by one of those singular coincidences in real life, which would be called improbable in a novel, that Mr. Montague's mansion adjoined that of the Duke, Mrs. Montague having, like most of the parvenu genus, a most violent penchant for the neighbourhood of the great, perhaps, in the hope that gentility might be infectious, and that she might catch a little by being near it. Both houses were in the Strand, which was, as we have before stated, in those days the most fashionable part of London, and both had beautiful gardens shelving down to the Thames. Mrs. Montague received her brother-in-law with all that awkward overstrained civility, with which persons raised above their original grade in society generally endeavour to show their respect to those whom they consider as their superiors, whilst Mr. Montague welcomed him with warm affection, and presented his daughter Clara to her uncle with all the fondness of a parent. Clara Montague well deserved his partiality, for she was a charming girl, and her light fairy form and animated features seemed to realize all that poets feign of Hebe. Sir Ambrose was delighted with her, and half his dislike of the mother banished, as he contemplated the budding charms of the daughter. It was well he had such an antidote, for poor Mrs. Montague, in her over-anxiety to render herself agreeable, contrived to be most excessively annoying to him. Perhaps, indeed, there are few things more troublesome than this vulgar attempt at politeness, and the good temper of the baronet was almost exhausted ere he retired for the night. Abelard, who had accompanied his master to town, and who often officiated as groom of the chamber, assisted him to undress, and, as usual with servants in those days, took the liberty of giving his opinion freely of their hostess. Sir Ambrose felt no interest in his remarks, but he did not check them, as he hoped, after he had exhausted this theme, he might turn the conversation upon Edric. The baronet was indeed excessively anxious to hear some news of his son, though he was by far too proud to make any inquiries respecting him. "So you really think Mrs. Montague disagreeable, Abelard?" said Sir Ambrose. "She is a perfect nuisance, your honour, to all civilized society. Why, I have observed her all day, and I verily believe she has never left your honour for 10 minutes, nor ever ceased for more than half an hour at a time, pressing your honour to eat." "True," said Sir Ambrose, laughing, "one would think she took me for a slave, and wanted to feed me up fat before she sent me to market to be sold." "Then she is so curious and inquisitive," resumed Abelard. "When she saw me bow to Master Edric just now, she was quite in a fever to know who he was, but I would not satisfy her." "Master Edric!" exclaimed the baronet. "What, then? Have you seen my son?" "Yes, your honour, and it startled me so that it made me raise the adnity of my visual organs like one of the anas genus when the clouds are charged with electric fluid, and my heart leaped from its transverse position on my diaphragm, and seemed to stick like a great bone right across my esophagus." "How did he look?" asked Sir Ambrose. "Not that I feel the slightest anxiety respecting him. No, his own conduct has quite precluded that. He was in a balloon, and when he saw me, he wrote something on a piece of paper with a pencil, and threw it down, desiring me to give it to your honour." "Where is it?" cried Sir Ambrose, endeavouring to conceal his anxiety. Abelard searched his pockets, and opened a large pocket-book, which he carefully examined, but in vain. "I am afraid I have lost it, your honour." "No, here it is." "Yes, no. These are some verses of my own, in the acromonogrammatic style, only every line begins with the same word with which the last ended, instead of the same letter. Shall I read them to your honour?" Sir Ambrose groaned in the spirit, and the unmerciful Abelard, taking that for a token of assent, deliberately unfolded the paper, and read as follows. "On love. Of all the powers in heaven above all others, triumphs love, love rules the soul, the heart invades the cities and the shades. Shades form no shelter from its power, power trembles in his courtly bower. bower of beauty, art thou free? Free thou art not, nor canst thou be. Be every other class released, released from love, thy woes increased, increased by all the weight of care, care flowing from complete despair. Humph, said Sir Ambrose. I hope your honour is pleased with this little effusion of my muse. Oh yes, it is very fine, Abelard. And your honour thinks it well turned, and well expressed. Excellently. Only I own I don't understand why despair comes in the last line. Despair, despair, oh. To rhyme with care, your honour. That reason is unanswerable, returned Sir Ambrose, smiling. And so you are quite sure you have lost Edric's note, not that it is of the least consequence, as nothing he could say can possibly alter my opinion of his conduct, but, if you had had it I thought I might as well have read it, to avoid the imputation of obstinacy. It is irrevocably gone, your honour. Well then, good night, and, if you should see Edric again, you may as well tell him the fate of his note, for, shamefully as he has behaved, I would not give him reason to accuse me of obstinacy. This was the second time the baronet had made the same observation. An ill-natured people might have said, but what do the remarks of ill-natured people signify to us? We hope all our readers will be good-natured ones, and as they will assuredly put the best possible construction upon Sir Ambrose's conduct, we will not be so malicious as to suggest an evil one. Edric was exceedingly agitated by his encounter with Abelard, and, feeling convinced his father was in town, he determined to delay his journey no longer, as his dread of meeting him was excessive. He therefore resolved to seek his tutor, and, if he found him still inclined to procrastinate, to set off without him. On reaching the doctor's chamber, however, he found half his anger converted into laughter at the ludicrous situation of the poor philosopher, who, surrounded as he was on every side by a crowd of tradesmen clamorous for orders, looked something like Mercury encircled by a tribe of discontented ghosts upon the banks of the Styx. Yes, yes, Mr. Jones, said he, I see you understand me. The coats are to be those woven in machines, where the wool is stripped off the sheep's back by one end, and the coat comes out completely made, in the newest fashion, at the other. Very well, sir, said Mr. Jones, wagging his ears in token of assent, for in those days of universal education, even the muscles of the head were trained to perform functions which in former days it was only supposed possible they might attain. You are quite right, sir, no person of fashion ever wears anything else now. Oh, Edric, cried the doctor, I shall be ready to attend to you directly, and so, Mrs. Celestina, you must make the soup, if you please, waterproof, and you, Mr. Crispin, must have the boots ready to dissolve, at a moment's notice. Oh, dear! Oh, dear, what a perplexity I am in, my head is going just like a steamboat, at the rate of 60 miles an hour. Upon my word, doctor, said Edric, looking round in dismay, if we are to take half the things assembled here, I do not know where we shall find a balloon large enough and strong enough even to raise us from the ground. I will show you one, replied the doctor, mysteriously, and solemnly drawing forth from his bosom a key, which appeared to have been suspended by a ribbon from his neck. He slowly opened, with great difficulty, a secret drawer in his escritoire, and produced from its inmost recesses a small bottle of Indian rubber. The gravity of the doctor's manner, and the length of time that he had employed in this operation, had excited Edric's curiosity, and he burst into a violent and uncontrollable fit of laughter when he saw the result. What is the matter, Edric? Asked the doctor, with the utmost solemnity. What can be the occasion of this unceremonious and ill-timed levity? Parturient mountains, my dear doctor, replied Edric, still laughing, you know the rest. Ridicule, Edric, said the doctor gravely, is by no means the test of truth. Fools often, nay, generally, laugh at what they cannot understand, and when I shall have explained the motives of my conduct, I trust you will feel ashamed of your present weak and unseasonable mirth. Caoutchouc, Edric, is a substance capable of astonishing dilation and contraction, whilst the peculiar elasticity and tenacity of its fibers give it a strength and solidity, very rare in bodies when in a state of extreme tension. There are several very extraordinary phenomena relating to elastic bodies, which I am happy to have an apposite opportunity of explaining to you. Edric yawned. You know, elastic substances have the power of wonderfully resisting a force which would annihilate solids, apparently infinitely stronger than themselves, as a featherbed will repulse a cannonball that would penetrate with ease through a thick table. Now the reason for this is clear. The elastic body has the power of summoning all its forces to its assistance, for the effect of a blow may be traced even to its remotest extremity, whereas the solid substance can only oppose its enemy by the mere resistance of the identical part struck. Certainly, said Edric, striving to suppress a yawn, nothing can be more clear. Nothing, resumed the doctor. I was sure you would admire the force of my reasoning. Indeed, I see the excess of your admiration in the involuntary yawns in which you have been indulging. On some occasions, Edric, man shakes off the artificial restraints of society, and breaks forth into the full freedom of honest and unsophisticated nature. Thus it was with you, Edric. In ancient times, the extension of the jaws was held synonymous with the extension of the understanding, and the opening of the mouth and eyes was considered as the greatest possible sign of pleasure that could be given. In the works of an ancient author, whose poetry was doubtless once esteemed very fine, since it is now quite unintelligible, we find the following passage. And Hodge stood lost in wide-mouthed speculation. Again. His eyes and mouth the hero opened wide. And divers others, which we will leave till a more convenient opportunity, if you please, said Edric, interrupting him. At present, do favor me for 5 minutes with your attention. We cannot take all these things. Why not? Asked the doctor, gazing at his pupil with surprise. For my part, I do not think we can dispense with a single article. These cloaks, said Edric, and those hampers, for instance, cannot be of the slightest use. I beg your pardon, returned the doctor. The cloaks are of asbestos, and will be necessary to protect us from ignition, if we should encounter any electric matter in the clouds, and the hampers are filled with elastic plugs for our ears and noses, and tubes and barrels of common air, for us to breathe when we get beyond the atmosphere of the earth. But what occasion shall we have to go beyond it? How can we do otherwise? Surely you don't mean to travel the whole distance in the balloon? I thought, of course, you would adopt the present fashionable mode of traveling, and after mounting the 17 miles or thereabouts, which is necessary to get clear of the mundane attraction, to wait there till the turning of the globe should bring Egypt directly under our feet. But it is not in the same latitude. True, I did not think of that. Well, then, sighing deeply, I suppose we must do without the hamper? Certainly, and without those boxes and bottles too, I hope. Oh no. We can't do without those. Those bottles contain my magic elixir, that cures all diseases merely by the smell, a new idea that. You know it has been long discovered, that the whole materia medica might be carried in a ring, and that all the instruments of surgery might be compressed into a walking stick. But the idea of sniffing health in a pinch of snuff is, I flatter myself, exclusively my own. Very likely, but we cannot be encumbered with your panacea in our aerial tour. Then that box contains my portable galvanic battery, that, my apparatus for making and collecting the inflammable air, and that, my machine for producing and concentrating the quicksilver vapor, which is to serve as the propelling power to urge us onwards, in the place of steam, and these bladders are filled with laughing gas, for the sole purpose of keeping up our spirits. The 3 first will be useful, said Edric, but I will positively have no more. Adieu. Adieu. Then, my precious treasures, exclaimed the doctor, looking sorrowfully around, dear offspring of my cares. Children of my mind. And must I leave you to some rude hand, which, heedless of your inestimable worth, may scatter your beauties to the winds? Alas! Alas! Breakfast is ready, and my lord is waiting, interrupted the shrill voice of one of Lord Gustavus's servants. Then we must go, said the doctor, and the rest of his pathetic lamentation remained forever buried in his own bosom. Lord Gustavus was already seated when they entered the room, with two gentlemen, whom he introduced to our travellers as Lord Noodle and Lord Doodle. These noble lords were both councillors of state as well as their illustrious host, and had attained that high honour in exactly the same way, viz. They had both succeeded their respective fathers. It is not easy to be very diffuse in their description, as they were members of that honourable and numerous fraternity, who never take the trouble of judging for themselves, but contentedly swim with the stream, whichever way it may flow, and have nothing about them to distinguish them in the slightest degree from the crowd. Lord Gustavus was at present their leading star, and they might very appropriately be termed his satellites. Thus, when any new idea was started, they cautiously refrained from giving an opinion till they found what he thought of it. They would then look wise, shake their heads, and say, exactly so. Certainly. Nobody can doubt it, or some of those other convenient ripieno phrases, which fill up so agreeably the pauses in the conversation, without requiring any troublesome exertion of the mental powers of either the hearer or the speaker. These gentlemen had now visited Lord Gustavus, for the purpose of accompanying him and Edric to the Queen's levee, and as soon as they had taken breakfast, the whole party, with the exception of Dr. Entwerfen, proceeded to court. When arrived there, however, they found the Queen had not yet risen. Her Majesty is late this morning, observed Lord Maysworth, a gentleman loaded with orders and decorations, addressing Lord Gustavus. I am not surprised, said his lordship, for her most gracious Majesty told me the other day, that she has slept badly for some time. Which, of course, caused you great grief, asked Dr. Hardman, a little, satirical-looking gentleman in a bob-wig. Thinking as I think, said Lord Gustavus gravely, and as I am sure everyone here must think, or at least ought to think, Her Majesty's want of sleep is a circumstance of very serious importance. Oh! Very, exclaimed Lord Noodle, shaking his head. Most assuredly, cried Lord Doodle, shaking his. Why, demanded the doctor, of what possible consequence can it be to her subjects, whether Her Majesty sleeps soundly or has the nightmare? Of the greatest consequence, replied Lord Gustavus solemnly. Nothing can be greater, echoed his satellites. Well, observed Lord Maysworth, for my part, I am such a traitor as to think we might exist, even if the Queen did not sleep at all. Or if she slept forever, rejoined the doctor significantly. Oh, fie, cried Lord Gustavus, what would become of us, if the great sun of the political hemisphere were to set? We must watch the rising of another, I suppose, said Lord Maysworth. Yes, continued Dr. Hardman, and then the energies of the people would be roused. They want awakening from their present slumber, they have slept too long under the paralyzing effects of tyranny. The government wants reform, corruption has eaten into its root, and it must be eradicated ere England can be free, or its people happy. Would to heaven I might live to aid in the glorious struggle, that I might see the people assert their rights, and the fiend, despotism, sink beneath their blows. I have ever admired, said Lord Maysworth, the high integrity and fine principles of the worthy doctor, which have not only obtained for him the applause of England, but the admiration of Europe. The courage, wisdom, and purity of his mind cannot be too highly extolled, and all who know him concur in calling him the firm and devoted friend of mankind. I also have been an humble supporter of plans of economy and retrenchment, and it was I who had the honour of suggesting to the Council the other day, that an humble petition should be presented to Her Majesty, requesting her respectfully to order a diminution of the lights in her saloon, proving incontestably that there were, at least, 6 more than were absolutely necessary. Thinking as I think, and as I am sure every one here must think, began Lord Gustavus, But ere he had time to finish his exordium, the folding doors at the back of the audience chamber were thrown open, and the queen appeared, sitting upon a gorgeous throne, and surrounded by the officers of her household all splendidly attired. The usual ceremonies then took place. Claudia smiled graciously on Edric, as he kissed her hand, and inquired when he intended to depart. Edric informed her on the morrow, when, condescending to express regret, and desiring to see him on his return, she wished him an agreeable voyage, and dismissed him. During their ride home, Lord Gustavus could talk of nothing but the graciousness of the Queen, upon which he was still expatiating, when the balloon stopped, and Edric, who, though he felt grateful for her kindness, was annoyed by hearing so much said of it, hastened to leave him as soon as he possibly could with propriety. On his road to his own apartment, however, he heard a strange and fearful noise, like the voice of someone screaming in an agony of rage and pain, which seemed to proceed from the chamber appropriated to his learned tutor, and he was going there to ascertain the cause, when the agitated form of the unfortunate philosopher burst upon him. Sad, indeed, was the condition in which this splendid ornament of the 22nd century now presented himself before the eyes of his astonished pupil. His face glowed like fire, his hat was off, and water streamed from every part of his body till he looked like the effigy of a water deity in a fountain. "Here is management," cried he, as soon as his rage permitted him to speak. "Here is treatment for one devoted to the service of mankind. But I will be revenged, and centuries yet to come shall tremble at my wrath." In this manner he continued, and being too much occupied in these awful denunciations, to be able to give any information as to what calamity had brought him into this unseemly plight, it will be necessary to go back a little to explain it for him. When Dr. Entwerfen left the breakfast room of Lord Gustavus, which he did not do till a considerable time after the rest of the party had quitted it, he was so absorbed in meditation that he did not know exactly which way he was going, and, happening unfortunately to turn to the right when he should have gone to the left, to his infinite surprise he found himself in the kitchen, instead of his own study. Absent as the doctor was, however, his attention was soon roused by the scene before him. Being, like many of his learned brotherhood, somewhat of a gourmand, his indignation was violently excited by finding the cook comfortably asleep on a sofa on one side of the room, whilst the meat intended for dinner, a meal it was then the fashion to take about noon, was as comfortably resting itself from its toils on the other. The chemical substitute for fire, which ought to have cooked it, having gone out, and the cook's nap precluding all reasonable expectation of its re-illumination, the doctor's wrath was kindled, though the fire was not, and in a violent rage he seized the gentle Celestina's shoulder, and shook her till she woke. "Where am I?" exclaimed she, opening her eyes. "Anywhere but where you ought to be," cried the doctor, in a fury. "Look, hussy! Look at that fine joint of meat, lying quite cold and sodden in its own steam." "Dear me," returned Celestina, yawning, "I am really quite unfortunate today. An unlucky accident has already occurred to a leg of mutton which was to have formed part of today's aliments, and now this piece of beef is also destroyed. I am afraid there will be nothing for dinner but some mucilaginous saccharine vegetables, and they, most probably, will be boiled to a viscous consistency." "And what excuse can you offer for all this?" exclaimed the doctor, his voice trembling with passion. "It was unavoidable," replied Celestina, coolly, "whilst I was copying a cast from the Apollo Belvedere this morning, having unguardedly applied too much caloric to the vessel containing the leg of mutton, the aqueous fluid in which it was immersed, evaporated, and the viand became completely calcined. Whilst the other affair—" "Hush, hush," interrupted the doctor, "I cannot bear to hear you mention it. Oh, surely Job himself never suffered such a trial of his patience. In fact, his troubles were scarcely worth mentioning, for he was never cursed with learned servants." Saying this the doctor retired, lamenting his hard fate in not having been born in those halcyon days when cooks drew nothing but their poultry, whilst the gentle Celestina's breast panted with indignation at his complaint. An opportunity soon offered for revenge, and seeing the doctor's steam valet ready to be carried to its master's chamber, she treacherously applied a double portion of caloric, in consequence of which, the machine burst whilst in the act of brushing the doctor's coat collar, and by discharging the whole of the scalding water contained in its cauldron upon him, reduced him to the melancholy state we have already mentioned. The fear of the ridicule attached to this incident, in a great measure reconciled the doctor to Edric's project of a speedy departure, and the following morning they bade adieu to Lord Gustavus, and, stepping into their balloon, sailed for Egypt. Chapter 9. No event of any importance occurred to our travellers in the course of their aerial voyage. They were too well provided with all kinds of necessaries to have any occasion to rest by the way, and in an incredibly short space of time they were hovering over Egypt. Different, however, how different from the Egypt of the 19th century, was the fertile country which now lay like a map beneath their feet. Improvement had turned her gigantic steps towards its once desert plains, commerce had waved her magic wand, and towns and cities, manufactories, and canals, spread in all directions. No more did the Nile overflow its banks, 1,000 channels were cut to receive its waters. No longer did the moving sands of the desert rise in mighty waves, threatening to overwhelm the way-worn traveler. Macadamized turnpike roads supplied their place, over which post-chaises, with anti-attritioned wheels, bowled at the rate of 15 miles an hour. Steamboats glided down the canals, and furnaces raised their smoky heads amidst groves of palm trees, whilst iron railways intersected orange groves, and plantations of dates and pomegranates might be seen bordering excavations intended for coal pits. Colonies of English and Americans peopled the country, and produced a population that swarmed like bees over the land, and surpassed in numbers even the wondrous throngs of the ancient Mizraim race, whilst industry and science changed desolation into plenty, and had converted barren plains into fertile kingdoms. Amidst all these revolutions, however, the pyramids still raised their gigantic forms, towering to the sky, unchanged, unchangeable, grand, simple, and immovable, fit symbols of that majestic nature they were intended to represent, and seeming to look down with contempt upon the ephemeral structures with which they were surrounded, as though they would have said, had utterance been permitted to them, avaunt, ye nothings of the day. Respect our dignity and sink into your original obscurity, for know, that we alone are monarchs of the plains. Indestructible, however, as they had proved themselves, even their granite sides had not been able entirely to resist the corroding influence of the smoke with which they were now surrounded, and a slight crumbling announced the first outward symptom of decay. Still, however, though blackened and disfigured, they shone stupendous monuments of former greatness, and Edric and his tutor gazed upon them with an awe that for some moments deprived them of utterance. The doctor, however, who was too fond of reasoning ever long to remain willingly silent, after surveying them a few minutes, broke forth as follows: "What noble piles! What majesty and grandeur they display in their formation, and yet what dignified simplicity! Can the imagination of man conceive anything more sublime than the thought that they have stood thus frowning in awful magnificence, perhaps since the very creation of the world, without equals, without even competitors, mocking the feeble efforts of man to divine their origin, and seeing generation after generation pass away, whilst they still remain immutable, and involved in the same deep and unfathomable mystery as at first?" "It is very strange," observed Edric, "that, in this age of speculation and discovery, nothing certain should be known concerning them." "It is," returned the doctor, "but the thick mysterious veil that has rested upon them for so many ages, seems not intended to be removed by mortal hands. They remind one of the sublime inscription upon the temple of the goddess Isis, at Sais, I am whatever was, whatever is, and whatever shall be, but no mortal has, as yet, presumed to raise the veil that covers me." "Your quotation is apt, doctor," resumed Edric, "for both relate to nature. Indeed, nature appears to be the deity which the ancient Egyptians worshipped, under all the various forms in which she presents herself, and their strange and animal deities were but reverenced as her symbols. It was nature whom they worshipped as Isis, it was nature that was typified in the pyramids, and the good taste of the Egyptians made them prefer the simple, the majestic, and the sublime, in those works which they destined to last for ages. Formerly, from the immensity of their population, and high state of their civilization, labor was so divided, and consequently so lightened, that multitudes were enabled to exist exempt from toil. These persons, devoting themselves to study, became initiati, and either enrolled themselves amongst the priesthood, or passed their lives in making themselves masters of the most abstract sciences. The consequences were natural. They followed up the ramifications of creation to their original source, they penetrated into the most profound secrets of nature, and traced all her wonders in her works, aware, however, of the taste of the vulgar for anything above their comprehension, and of the natural craving of the human mind for mystery. They wrapped the discoveries they had made in a deep and impenetrable veil, and concealed awful and sublime significations under the meanest and most disgusting images. "You are right," said the doctor, "in your observations upon the religion of the ancient Egyptians, but it does not appear to me that the pyramids were erected by them." "What? I suppose you draw your conclusions from the want of hieroglyphics in their principal chambers, and, from what Herodotus says of their having been erected by a shepherd, you think they were the work of the Palic race." "No, though I allow much may be said in favor of that hypothesis, particularly as Herodotus says the kings under whom they were erected, ordered all the Egyptian temples to be closed, which we know the shepherd or Palic sovereign did, but I cannot imagine that an ignorant, Gothic race of shepherds, men accustomed to live in tents or in the open air, and possessing no talents but for war, were capable of constructing such immense piles. No, no, the pyramids required gigantic conceptions, highly cultivated minds, and unwearied perseverance, all qualities quite incompatible with a warlike wandering race. No, I do not think the Pali were capable of imagining such structures, much less of constructing them. I think they were the work of evil spirits." "Evil spirits," exclaimed Edric. "Yes," returned the doctor. "We are told that the evil spirits, after their expulsion from paradise, were under the command of the Sultan, or Solomon Giam ben Giam, as he is called by Arabic writers, but who is supposed to have been the same as Cheops, and that he employed them in this vast work. I do not know by what analysis etymologists can draw the name of Cheops from that of Giam ben Giam, but, supposing the fact to be correct, that they designated the same person, I think it only proves more strongly my hypothesis, for the Pali came from Mount Caucasus, where the evil spirits were said to have been enchained, and if Cheops was a Palic king, it is possible the Egyptians might poetically call their conquerors evil spirits. That is a good idea, Edric, though I do not think it by any means certain that Cheops was a Palic king. However, we shall soon be able to see his tomb, and judge for ourselves, for we have now approached near enough to the pyramids to descend. Foh! What a smoke and what a noise! It is enough to rouse the mummies from their slumbers before their appointed time, and without the aid of galvanism. Have you opened the valves, Edric? Oh yes. I perceive we are getting lower, we will not lose a moment before we visit the pyramid. But what a crowd of brutes are assembled to witness our arrival! They stare as though they had never seen a balloon before. Egypt is certainly a fine country, but the inhabitants are a century behind us in civilization. An immense crowd had gathered together to witness the descent of our travelers, and they did indeed stand staring, lost in stupid astonishment at the strange sight that presented itself, for though the Egyptian people had occasionally seen balloons, they had never before beheld one made of Indian rubber. The odd figure of the doctor, too, amused them exceedingly, as he sat wrapped up in the most dignified manner in an asbestos cloak, his bob-wig pushed a little on one side from the heat of the weather and the warmth of his argument, his round, red, oily face attempting to look solemn, and his little, fat, punchy figure trying to assume an air of majesty. The Egyptians were amazingly struck with this apparition, and being, like most colonists, somewhat conceited and not very ceremonious in their manners, they looked at him a few minutes in silence, and then burst into immoderate fits of laughter. The doctor was exceedingly indignant at this rude reception, and rising, shook his fist at them in anger, a maneuver, however, that only redoubled the mirth of the unpolished Egyptians, whose peals of laughter now became so tremendous, that they actually shook the skies, and occasioned a most unpleasant vibration in the balloon. Edric, who was almost as much annoyed as the doctor, had yet sufficient self-command to continue calmly making preparations for his descent, and without taking the least notice of the crowd below, he screwed the top upon the propelling vapor bottle. He let the inflammable air escape from the balloon, which rapidly collapsed as they approached the earth, and throwing out their patent spring grappling irons, they caught one of the lower stones of the Great Pyramid, and in a few moments the car, in which our travelers were sitting, was safely moored at a convenient distance from the earth for them to alight. Edric now unloosed the descending ladder, and reverentially assisted the doctor, who was encumbered with his long cloak, to reach terra firma in safety, amidst the bustle and exclamations of the crowd, who thronged round them expressing their wonder and astonishment audibly, in broad English. "Where the deuce did this spring from?" cried one. "The car would load a wagon." "And what is gone with the balloon?" said another. "It is clean vanished." "Well, I never saw such a thing in all my life before," exclaimed a third. "I think they must be come from the moon." "Hush! Hush!" cried an old gentleman bustling amongst them, who seemed as one having authority. "What's the matter? What's the matter?" "We are strangers, sir," said Edric, advancing and addressing him. "We come here to see the wonders of your country, and we wish to explore the pyramids, but the reception we have met with—" say no more," interrupted the worthy justice, for such he was. "Get about your business, you rapscallions, or I'll read the riot act. Here, Gregory, call out the posse comitatus, and set a guard of constables to keep watch over these gentlemen's balloon, whilst they go to explore the pyramids." "Eh? But where is the balloon? I don't see it." "I hope neither of the gentlemen has put it in his pocket," laughing at his own wit. "No, sir," returned Edric, smiling, "though it is a feat which might easily be accomplished, for that is our balloon," pointing to the caoutchouc bottle, now shrunk to its original dimensions. "Very strange, that," said the justice, very curious indeed." "Well, gentlemen, if you wish to proceed immediately, you'll want a guide of course. These cottages at the foot of the pyramids are all inhabited by guides, who get their living by showing the sights. They are sad rogues, most of them, but I can recommend you to one who is a very honest man. Here, Samuel," continued he, knocking against a small door, "Samuel, I say." Samuel made his appearance, in the guise of a tall, raw-boned, stupid-looking fellow, with a pair of immensely broad stooping shoulders, which looked as though he could have relieved Atlas occasionally of his burthen, without much trouble to himself. Coming forth from his hut in an awkward shambling pace, he scratched his head, and demanded what his honor pleased to want. "You must show these gentlemen the pyramids," said the justice. "That I will with pleasure," returned Samuel. "I've got my living by showing them these 50 years, man and boy, and I know every crink and cranny of them, though I'm old now and somewhat lame. So walk this way, gentlemen." "We are very much obliged to you, sir," said the doctor, bowing to the justice, who was in fact one of those good-natured, busy, bustling men, who are always better pleased to transact any other person's business than their own, and are never so happy as when a new arrival gives them an opportunity of showing off their consequence. Indeed, there is a pleasure in showing wonders to a stranger, that only those who have little else to occupy their minds can properly estimate. A man of this kind feels his self-love gratified by the superiority his local knowledge gives him over a stranger, and, as it is, perhaps, the only chance he ever can have of showing superiority, they must be unreasonable who blame him for making the most of it. Justice Fremantle was accordingly exceedingly delighted with travelers who seemed disposed to submit implicitly to his dictation, and he returned a most gracious reply to the doctor's thanks. Don't mention it. Don't mention it, my dear sir, said he. I am never so happy as when I can make myself useful. Is there anything else I can do for you? You may command me, I assure you, and you may depend upon it, no injury shall be done to your luggage, whilst you are away. What a very civil, obliging, good-natured old gentleman, said the doctor, as they walked towards the entrance of the pyramids. I declare he almost reconciles me to the country, though, I own, I thought at first the people were the greatest brutes I had ever met with. Which pyramid does your honor wish to see? Asked the guide. That which contains the tomb of Cheops, man, cried the doctor solemnly, who, encumbered with his long cloak, and loaded with his walking stick and galvanic battery, had some difficulty in getting on. Won't your honor let me carry that pole and that bag, said the man, you'd get on a surprising deal better, if you would. Avaunt, wretch, exclaimed the doctor, nor offer to touch with thy profane fingers the immortal instruments of science. The man stared, but fell back, and the whole party walked on in perfect silence. In the meantime, Edric had walked on before his companions, completely lost in meditation. A crowd of conflicting thoughts rushed through his mind, and now, when he found himself at the very goal of his wishes, the daring nature of the purpose he had so long entertained, seemed to strike him for the first time, and he trembled at the consequences that might attend the completion of his desires. With his arms folded on his breast, he stood gazing on the pyramids, whilst his ideas wandered uncontrolled through the boundless regions of space. And what am I, thought he, weak, feeble worm that I am? Who dare seek to penetrate into the awful secrets of my Creator? Why should I wish to restore animation to a body now resting in the quiet of the tomb? What right have I to renew the struggles, the pains, the cares, and the anxieties of mortal life? How can I tell the fearful effects that may be produced by the gratification of my unearthly longing? May I not revive a creature whose wickedness may involve mankind in misery? And what if my experiment should fail, and if the moment when I expect my rash wishes to be accomplished, the hand of almighty vengeance should strike me to the earth, and heap molten fire on my brain to punish my presumption? The sound of human voices, as the doctor and the guide approached, grated harshly on the nerves of Edric, already overstrained by the awful nature of the thoughts in which he had been indulging, and he turned away involuntarily, to escape the interruption he dreaded, quite forgetting for the moment from whom the sounds most probably proceeded. Lord have mercy on us, said the guide, I declare that gentleman looks as if he were beside himself. And see there. If he hasn't walked right by the entrance to the pyramid without seeing it. Sir! Sir, halloed he. Excessively annoyed, but recalled to his recollection by these shouts, Edric returned. These pyramids are wonderful piles, said the doctor, as he stumbled forward to meet him. I really had no adequate conception of the enormity of their size. They did not even look half so large at a distance as they do now. Immense masses seldom do, replied Edric, compelling himself with difficulty to speak. True, returned the doctor, the simplicity and uniformity of their figures deceive the eyes, and it is only when we approach them that we feel their stupendous magnitude and our own insignificance. They give an amazing idea of the grandeur of the ancient kings of Egypt, said Edric, without exactly knowing what he was saying. Their palaces must have been superb, if they had such mausoleums. How absurdly you reason, Edric, replied the doctor peevishly, for, being annoyed with his burthens and his cloak, he was not in a humor to bear contradiction. I thought we had settled that question before. In the first place, I think it very doubtful whether the Egyptians had anything to do with the building of these monuments, and if they had, I think they were meant for temples, not mausoleums, and in the next place, even if they were intended for tombs, their greatness affords no argument for the splendor of the surrounding palaces, as the Egyptians were celebrated for the superiority of their burying places, and for the immense sums they expended upon them. Indeed, you know, ancient writers say they went so far as to call the houses of the living only inns, whilst they considered tombs as everlasting habitations, a circumstance, by the way, that strongly corroborates my hypothesis, at least as far as their opinions go, as it seems to imply that both soul and body were designed to remain there. They had now entered the pyramid, and were proceeding with infinite difficulty along a low, dark, narrow passage. "Observe, Edric," said the doctor, "how the difficulty and obscurity of these winding passages confirm my opinion. You know, the religion of the ancient Egyptians, like that of the ancient Hindus, was one of penances and personal privations, and, granting that to be the case, what can be more simple than that the passages the initiati had to traverse before they reached the adytum should be painful and difficult of access? Besides this, as you know, the bones of a bull, no doubt those of the god Apis, were found in a sarcophagus in the second pyramid. It seems probable that it was sacred to his worship, and its vicinity to the Nile, which was indispensable to the temples of Apis, as, when it was time for him to die, he was drowned in its waters, confirms the fact. Indeed, I am only surprised that any human being, possessing a grain of common sense, can entertain a single doubt upon the subject. How do you account for the tomb we are about to visit being placed in the pyramid, if you think they were only designed for a temple?" asked Edric. "The question is futile," said the doctor. "A strange fancy prevailed in former times that burying the dead in consecrated places, particularly in temples intended for divine worship, would scare away the evil spirits, and the practice actually prevailed in England even as lately as the 19th or 20th century. Indeed, it was not till after the country had been almost depopulated by the dreadfully infectious disease that prevailed about 200 years ago, that a law was passed to prevent the interment of the dead in London, and that those previously buried in and near the churches there, were exhumed and placed in cemeteries beyond the walls." Edric did not reply, for in fact his ideas were so absorbed by the solemn object before him, that it was painful for him to speak, and the doctor's ill-timed reasoning created such an irritation of his nerves, that he found it required the utmost exertion of his self-command to endure it patiently. The passage they were traversing now became higher and wider, shelving off occasionally into chambers or recesses on each side, till they approached a kind of vestibule, in the centre of which yawned a deep, dark, gloomy-looking cavity, like a well. "We must descend that shaft," said the guide, "and that will lead us to the tomb of King Cheops, but as the road is dark, and rather dangerous, we had better, each of us, take a torch." As he spoke, he drew some torches from a niche where they were deposited, and began to illuminate them from his own. The red glare of the torches flashed fearfully on the massive whales of the pyramid, throwing part of their enormous masses into deep shadow, as they rose in solemn and sublime dignity around, and seemed frowning upon the presumptuous mortals that had dared to invade their recesses, whilst the deep pit beneath their feet seemed to yawn wide to engulf them in its abyss. Edric's heart beat thick, it throbbed till he even fancied its pulsations audible, and a strange, mysterious thrilling of anxiety, mingled with a wild, undefinable delight, ran through his frame. A few short hours, and his wishes would be gratified, or set at rest forever. The doctor and the guide had already begun to descend, and their figures seemed changed and unearthly as the gleams of the torches fell upon them. Edric gazed for a moment, and then followed with feelings worked up almost to frenzy by the overexcitement of his nerves, whilst the hollow sound that re-echoed from the walls, as they struck against them in their descent, thrilled through his whole frame. No one spoke, and after proceeding for some time along the narrow path, or rather ledge, formed on the sides of the cavity, which gradually shelved downwards, the guide suddenly stopped, and touching a secret spring, a solid block of granite slowly detached itself from the wall, and, rising majestically like the portcullis of an ancient fortress, showed the entrance to a dark and dreary cave. The guide advanced, followed by our travellers, into a gloomy vaulted apartment, where long vistas of ponderous arches stretched on every side, till their termination was lost in darkness, and gave a feeling of immensity and obscurity to the scene. "I will wait here," said the guide, "and here, if you please, you had better leave your torches." That avenue will lead you to the tomb." The travelers obeyed, and the guide, placing himself in a recess in the wall, extinguished all the torches except one, which he shrouded so as to leave the travelers in total darkness. Nothing could be now more terrific than their situation, immured in the recesses of the tomb, involved in darkness, and their bosoms throbbing with hopes that they scarcely dared avow even to themselves. With faltering steps they proceeded slowly along the path the guide had pointed out, shuddering even at the hollow echo of their own footsteps, which alone broke the solemn silence that reigned throughout these fearful regions of terror and the tomb. Suddenly, a vivid light flashed upon them, and, as they advanced, they found it proceeded from torches placed in the hands of two colossal figures, who, placed in a sitting posture, seemed guarding an enormous portal, surmounted by the image of a fox, the constant guardian of an Egyptian tomb. The immense dimensions and air of grandeur and repose about these colossi had something in it very imposing, and our travelers felt a sensation of awe creep over them as they gazed upon their calm unmoved features, so strikingly emblematic of that immutable nature which they were doubtless placed there to typify. It was with feelings of indescribable solemnity that the doctor and Edric passed through this majestic portal, and found themselves in an apartment gloomily illumined by the light shed faintly from an inner chamber, through ponderous brazen gates beautifully wrought. The light thus feebly emitted showed that the room in which they stood was dedicated to Typhon, the evil spirit, as his fierce and savage types covered the walls, and images of his symbols, the crocodile and the dragon, placed beneath the shadow of the brazen gates, and dimly seen by the imperfect light, seemed starting into life, and grimly to forbid the farther advance of the intruders. Our travelers shuddered, and opening with trembling hand the ponderous gates, they entered the tomb of Cheops. In the center of the chamber stood a superb, highly ornamented sarcophagus of alabaster, beautifully wrought. Over this hung a lamp of wondrous workmanship, supplied by a potent mixture, so as to burn for ages unconsumed, thus awfully lighting up with perpetual flame the solemn mansions of the dead, and typifying life eternal even in the silent tomb. Around the room, on marble benches, were arranged mummies simply dried, apparently those of slaves, and close to the sarcophagus was placed one contained in a case, which the doctor approached to examine. This was supposed to be that of Sors, the confidant and prime minister of Cheops. The chest that enclosed the body was splendidly ornamented with embossed gilt leather, whilst the parts not otherwise covered were stained with red and green curiously blended, and of a vivid brightness. The mighty Pharaoh, the Jupiter of the Egyptians, spread its widely extended wings over the head, grasping in his monstrous claws a ring, the emblem of eternity, whilst below, the vulture form of Rhea proclaimed the deceased devotee of that powerful deity, and on the sides were innumerable hieroglyphics. The doctor removed the lid, and shuddered as the crimson tinge of the everlasting lamp fell upon the hideous and distorted features thus suddenly exhibited to view. This sepulchral light, indeed, added unspeakable horror to the scene, and its peculiar glare threw such a wild and demoniac expression on the dark lines and ghastly lineaments of the mummies, that even the doctor felt his spirits depressed, and a supernatural dread creep over his mind as he gazed upon them. In the meantime, Edric had stood gazing upon the sarcophagus of Cheops, the sides of which were beautifully sculptured with groups of figures, which, from the peculiar light thrown upon them, seemed to possess all the force and reality of life. On one side was represented an armed and youthful warrior bearing off in his arms a beautiful female, on whom he gazed with the most passionate fondness. He was pursued by a crowd of people and soldiers, who seemed rending the air with vehement exclamations against his violence, and endeavoring in vain to arrest his progress, whilst in the background appeared an old man, who was tearing his hair and wringing his hands in ineffectual rage against the ravisher. The other side presented the same old man wrestling with the youthful warrior, who had just overpowered and stabbed him, the helpless victim raising his withered hands and failing eyes to heaven as he fell, as though to implore vengeance upon his murderer, whilst the crimson current was fast ebbing from his bosom. The dying look and agony of the old man were forcibly depicted, whilst upon the features of the youthful warrior glowed the fury of a demon. The sarcophagus was supported by the lion, emblem of royalty, the symbol of the solar god Horus, and above it sat the majestic hawk of Osiris, gazing upwards, and unmindful of the subtle crocodile of Typhon, that, crouching under its feet, was just about to seize its breast in its enormous jaws. Neither of the travelers had as yet spoken, for it seemed like sacrilege to disturb the awful stillness that prevailed even by a whisper. Indeed, the solemn aspect of the chamber thrilled through every nerve, and they moved slowly, gliding along with noiseless steps as though they feared prematurely to break the slumbers of the mighty dead it contained. They gazed, however, with deep but undefinable interest upon the sculptured mysteries of the tomb of Cheops, vainly endeavoring to decipher their meaning, whilst, as they found their efforts useless, a secret voice seemed to whisper in their bosoms, "And shall finite creatures like these, who cannot even explain the signification of objects presented before their eyes, presume to dive into the mysteries of their Creator's will? Learn wisdom by this omen, nor seek again to explore secrets above your comprehension. Retire whilst it is yet time, soon it will be too late." Edric started at his own thoughts, as the fearful warning, "Soon it will be too late," rang in his ears, and a fearful presentiment of evil weighed heavily upon his soul. He turned to look upon the doctor, but he had already seized the lid of the sarcophagus, and, with a daring hand, removed it from its place, displaying in the fearful light the royal form that lay beneath. For a moment, both Edric and the doctor paused, not daring to survey it, and when they did, they both uttered an involuntary cry of astonishment, as the stern, but handsome, features of the mummy met their eyes, for both instantly recognized the sculptured warrior in his traits. Yes, it was indeed the same, but the fierce expression of fiery and ungoverned passions depicted upon the countenance of the marble figure had settled down to a calm, vindictive, and concentrated hatred upon that of its mummy prototype in the tomb. Awful, indeed, was the gloom that sat upon that brow, and bitter the sardonic smile that curled those haughty lips. All was perfect as though life still animated the form before them, and it had only reclined there to seek a short repose. The dark eyebrows, the thick raven hair which hung upon the forehead, and the snow-white teeth seen through the half-open lips, forbade the idea of death, whilst the fiend-like expression of the features made Edric shudder, as he recollected the purpose that brought him to the tomb, and he trembled at the thought of awakening such a fearful being from the torpor of the grave to all the renewed energies of life. "Let us go," whispered the doctor to his pupil, in a low, deep, and unearthly tone, fearfully different from his usually cheerful voice. Edric started at the sound, for it seemed the last sad warning of his better genius, before he abandoned her forever. The die, however, was cast, and it was too late to recede. Indeed, Edric felt worked up to frenzy by the overwrought feelings of the moment. He seized the machine, and resolutely advanced towards the sarcophagus, whilst the doctor gazed upon him with a horror that deprived him of either speech or motion. Innumerable folds of red and white linen, disposed alternately, swathed the gigantic but well-proportioned limbs of the royal mummy, and upon his breast lay a piece of metal, shining like silver, and stamped with the figure of a winged globe. Edric attempted to remove this, but recoiled with horror, when he found it bend beneath his fingers with an unnatural softness, whilst, as the flickering light of the lamp fell upon the face of the mummy, he fancied its stern features relaxed into a ghastly laugh of scornful mockery. Worked up to desperation, he applied the wires of the battery and put the apparatus in motion, whilst a demoniac laugh of derision appeared to ring in his ears, and the surrounding mummies seemed starting from their places and dancing in unearthly merriment. Thunder now roared in tremendous peals through the pyramids, shaking their enormous masses to the foundation, and vivid flashes of light darted round in quick succession. Edric stood aghast amidst this fearful convulsion of nature. A horrid creeping seemed to run through every vein, every nerve feeling as though drawn from its extremity, and wrapped in icy chillness round his heart. Still, he stood immovable, and gazing intently on the mummy, whose eyes had opened with the shock, and were now fixed on those of Edric, shining with supernatural luster. In vain Edric attempted to rouse himself, in vain to turn away from that withering glance. The mummy's eyes still pursued him with their ghastly brightness. They seemed to possess the fabled fascination of those of the rattlesnake, and though he shrunk from their gaze, they still glared horribly upon him. Edric's senses swam, yet he could not move from the spot. He remained fixed, chained, and immovable, his eyes still riveted upon the mummy, and every thought absorbed in horror. Another fearful peal of thunder now rolled in lengthened vibrations above his head, and the mummy rose slowly, his eyes still fixed upon those of Edric, from his marble tomb. The thunder pealed louder and louder. Yells and groans seemed mingled with its roar. The sepulchral lamp flared with redoubled fierceness, flashing its rays around in quick succession, and with vivid brightness, whilst by its horrid and uncertain glare, Edric saw the mummy stretch out its withered hand as though to seize him. He saw it rise gradually, he heard the dry, bony fingers rattle as it drew them forth, he felt its tremendous gripe. Human nature could bear no more, his senses were rapidly deserting him. He felt, however, the fixed steadfast eyes of Cheops still glowing upon his failing orbs, as the lamp gave a sudden flash, and then all was darkness. The brazen gates now shut with a fearful clang, and Edric, uttering a shriek of horror, fell senseless upon the ground, whilst his shrill cry of anguish rang wildly through the marble vaults, till its re-echoes seemed like the yell of demons joining in fearful mockery. How long he lay in this state he knew not, but when he reopened his eyes, for the moment, he fancied all that had passed a dream. As his senses returned, however, he recollected where he was, and shuddered to find himself yet in that place of horrors. All now was dark, except a faint gleam that shone feebly through the half-open gates. These ponderous portals slowly unclosed, and the form of a man, wrapped in a large cloak, and bearing a torch, entered, peering around as it advanced, as though half afraid to proceed. Edric's feelings were too highly wrought to bear any fresh horrors, and he shrieked in agony as the figure approached. The sound of his voice subdued the terrors of the intruder, and the doctor, for it was he, shouted with joy, as he rushed forward to embrace him. "Edric! Edric! Thank God he is alive," exclaimed he. "Edric! My beloved Edric! For God's sake, let us leave this den of horrors. Come, come." Reassured by his tutor's voice, Edric arose, and taking one hasty, shuddering glance around as the light gleamed on the sarcophagus, he hurried out of the tomb. Neither he nor the doctor spoke as they passed through the vestibule, where the colossal figures still sat in awful majesty. Indeed, as their torches were extinguished, their gigantic forms looked still more terrific than before, from the wavering and indistinct light thrown upon them. Edric shuddered as he looked, and hurried on with hasty strides to the place where they had left the guide, whom they found kneeling in a corner, hiding his face in his hands, and roaring out, "O Lord, defend us! Heaven have mercy upon us! Lord have mercy upon us! Heaven have mercy upon us!" "He has been in that state for more than an hour," said the doctor mournfully, "for, after I came to myself again, I tried to rouse him, but all to no purpose." "Then you also fainted," said Edric, with difficulty compelling himself to speak. "Why," resumed the doctor with some hesitation, "I don't know that you can exactly call it fainting, but the fact was, that when I saw you touch the plate upon the mummy's breast, and start back, looking so horribly frightened, I thought I had better call for assistance, so as I ran for that purpose, somehow or other, I fell down, and lay insensible I don't know how long. When I came to myself, however, I tried to rouse the guide, and when I found I could not, I came to seek you, but now that we are both recovered, I really don't know what is to become of us, for this fellow will never be able to show us the way out, and I'm sure I don't know the road." "Let us try to find it, at any rate," said Edric faintly. "Oh, for God's sake, take me too," screamed the guide. "If you have any mercy, don't leave me in this fearful place." "Take the light then, and lead the way," said Edric. The guide obeyed, shaking every limb, and every now and then casting a terrified look behind, whilst the quivering flame of the torch betrayed the unsteadiness of the trembling hands that bore it. In this manner they proceeded, starting at every sound, and frightened even at their own shadows, without daring to stop till they reached the plain. "Thank God," cried the doctor, the moment they stepped out of the pyramid, looking round him, gasping for breath, and inhaling the fresh air with rapture. "Thank God," reiterated Edric and the guide, as they walked rapidly towards the place where they had left their balloon. When arrived there, however, they looked for it in vain, and fancying themselves under the influence of a delusion, they rubbed their eyes, and again looked, but without success. "Dear me, it is very strange," said the doctor. "This is certainly the place, and yet, where can it be?" "Where, indeed," repeated Edric. "Horrors and unaccountable incidents environ us at every step. I am not naturally timid, yet." "Ah!" screamed the doctor, as he tumbled over a man lying with his face upon the ground. "Oh," groaned he, as Edric and the guide with difficulty raised him, "would to heaven I were safe at home again in my own comfortable little study, indulging on pleasing anticipations of that which I find is anything in the world but pleasing in reality." Chapter 10. We left Dr. Entwerfen in the last chapter uttering a very moral, if not a very new, exclamation on the vanity of human expectations, which had scarcely escaped from his lips, ere cruel fate, resolving not to be accused in vain, supplied him with yet more abundant cause for lamentation. We have before mentioned that the doctor had stumbled as he quitted the pyramids, and that his friends raised him from the ground, but what was his consternation and dismay, when, on looking round to thank them, he found he was surrounded by armed men, who commanded him in the royal name to surrender. Sadly did the doctor turn his woeful eyes upon Edric, but, alas! He was in the same predicament as himself, and, in spite of their entreaties, they were marched off to prison, without being at all informed of what crime they had committed. Sadly passed the night, and gloomy dawned the day upon the unfortunate travellers, whose minds were harassed and bewildered by the extraordinary success of their awful experiment, and whose misery was infinitely increased by the suspense they had to suffer, both on account of their ignorance of the crime of which they were accused, and its probable punishment if they should be found guilty. Soon after daybreak, however, a summons for them arrived, and they were conducted as criminals before the same magistrate who, the day before, had treated them with such officious kindness. Very different, however, was the solemn judge who, clothed in all the insignia of magisterial dignity, now sate upon the bench, from the easy, good-tempered gentleman of the pyramids, and the unlucky travellers saw, in an instant, that they were not likely to experience any favour from their previous acquaintance with him. The court was thronged with people, and the prisoners saw that they were regarded with curiosity, mingled with horror and supernatural fear. It is not agreeable to feel oneself an object of disgust to anyone, and though Edric magnanimously and frequently repeated to himself that it was quite indifferent to him what such ignorant wretches as Egyptians thought of him, yet, if he would have avowed the truth, he would have been quite as well contented to have found himself the object of their admiration instead of their hatred, and he would have been very glad to have been safely at home again, whilst the doctor openly and loudly lamented the much regretted comforts of his own dear delightful study at Sir Ambrose's. Little time, however, was allowed for reflection, for as soon as the prisoners were placed at the bar their examination commenced. "So, gentlemen," said the learned judge, "you stand convicted, no, I mean accused, of a most horrible, heinous, and sacrilegious offence, an offence that makes our hair start with horror from our heads, and every separate lock rise up in vengeance against you." The justice paused, that the prisoners might admire his eloquence, but, alas! Such was the absorbing nature of self-love, that they were only thinking of what was going to be done with them, and to what this terrible exordium was likely to lead. After a short pause, Edric, supposing they were expected to speak, addressed the judge, and begged to know of what crime they were accused. "We are strangers," said he, "and gentlemen. We were attracted to your country by an account of the wonders it contained. We declared our purposes openly, we have affected no concealment, and we have done nothing we need blush to avow." A confused murmur ran through the court as he spoke, expressive of the utmost disgust and abhorrence. Edric felt indignant, and he looked round proudly as he added, "Yes, I repeat, we have done nothing we need blush to avow, and nothing derogatory to our characters as Englishmen and gentlemen." "Sorcerers!" Wizards! Demons in disguise, cried the crowd. Down with them! Burn them! Guillotine them! Destroy them! Is this fair? Is this generous? Asked Edric. If we have done wrong, let our crime be proved, and we are ready to submit to any punishment you may think proper to inflict, but do not condemn us unheard. In England, every man is deemed innocent until he be proved guilty. You boast of having imported and improved upon all the useful regulations of the mother country, and cannot surely have omitted her most glorious law. Let us then have a fair trial, and God forbid that the course of justice should be impeded. You talk well, sir, said the judge, but it's of no use here. My chair, sir, is made of wych elm, and the whole court is lined with consecrated wood, so you may take your familiars to another market, for here they will avail you nothing. Good God, exclaimed Edric, wringing his hands, what ignorance! What gross superstition! And yet, in this man's power are our lives. Oh! Oh, said the judge, who saw his despair, though he did not exactly know the cause. I have brought you to, have I? Yes, yes, I tell you, no incantations will be of any avail here, and so, clerk, call the witnesses. The first person examined was the man who had been left in charge of the balloon, and he deposed as follows. Why, sir, said he, scratching his head, as though he supposed wisdom dwelt in his fingers, and that their touch might give a little to his brain, your honour told me to call out the posse comitatus, and set a guard of constables over the gentleman's whirligig, but I thought as how, seeing it was but a queer-looking thing, and not likely to tempt anybody to steal it, I might as well save the gentlemen from throwing their money away upon a parcel of idle fellows, and keep watch over it myself. And so get the reward instead of them, observed the judge. Why, your honour, said the fellow, grinning, I thought they might give something that might do me some good, but that it would be nothing amongst so many. Very true, remarked the judge. Go on, Gregory. Well, continued Gregory, as I was sitting there, thinking of nothing at all, and somehow, I believe, I had fallen into a bit of a doze, I heard a queer sort of a buzzing, and I opened my eyes, and there I saw the gentleman's whirligig buzzing and puffing like a steam engine on fire, and I take mist o' the smoke. I'll take my oath I saw the mummy of King Cheops as plain as I see his worship there sitting in his throne. Oh, groaned the horror-struck crowd, oh, groaned the judge and jury. Yes, continued the man, I'll take my oath, if it was the last word I had to speak, that I saw him there vomiting fire, and his big eyes flaring like a fiery furnace. Oh, groaned the judge, crowd, and jury, a degree louder than before. And then, resumed Gregory, something went whiz, and off it all fled together like a flash of lightning. Oh, shrieked the whole court, in a convulsion of horror. Some of the fair sex in particular, screamed and covered their faces, as though they feared the next exploit of the redoubtable magicians would be to blow up the court, and send them all flying after the resuscitated mummy. With your permission, sir, said Edric, as soon as the tumult had somewhat abated, this proves nothing against either my friend or myself. We are, in fact, injured by it, and we have a claim against you instead of your being able to substantiate a charge against us. We left our balloon, containing valuable articles, and money to a considerable amount, in your charge, or, at least, in the custody of a man whom you recommended. When we quitted the pyramid, we, of course, inquired for our balloon. It had vanished, and instead of making us amends for our loss, you throw us into prison and tell us a wild, extravagant story of the disappearance of our property, which no man in his senses can possibly believe. Another confused murmur, though very different in its character from the former, ran through the court on the conclusion of this speech, and the judge, if such an expression be not profane when speaking of a representative of justice, looked most excessively foolish. Had not your worship better call the other witnesses, whispered the clerk, pitying the dilemma of his principal. True, true, said the Lycurgus of Anglo-Egypt, your observation is premature, young man, when the case has been proved against you, it will be time enough for you to think of your defense. Edric bowed assent, and the examination continued. The guide was the next witness. Well, Samuel, said the judge, what do you know about this matter? Why, sir, replied Samuel, ye see, my dame and I were sitting by the fire, and we'd got a black pudding, as we was a-going to have for our dinners. And so says dame, I likes it cut in slices and fried, and so says I. Hold, fellow, cried the judge, with great dignity. Don't abuse the patience of the court. We have nothing to do with your dame or the black pudding, it is quite irrelevant to the matter now before us. Go on. But Samuel could not go on, and, like his predecessor in the witness box, he only stood still and scratched his head. Why don't you speak, fellow? Asked the clerk. Because I doesn't know what to say, replied Samuel. You must tell all you know about this affair, pursued the clerk. But I doesn't know where to begin, rejoined the perplexed witness, his worship says it is not reverent. Begin with the pyramid, said the judge, and, if you can, give a clear account of all that happened after you left the old passage by the movable block in the wall that was last discovered. Why, I can't say there was anything very particular happened, as I know of, sir, said Samuel, after that, till we got to the shaft, and then we went down, sir, you know, as we always does, till we came to the tomb of King Cheops, and then I turned the gentlemen in by themselves, as we always does, for the fecht, as Parson Snorum calls it. And then I sits me down I the vault, to wait for and I'd just rolled myself up, and was dozed asleep, when I hears such a noise as if the pyramids were all coming tumbling about my ears. So up I jumped and rubbed my eyes, for I did not know very well where I was, and then I saw something that seemed to strike the torches out of the hands of the two great sitting figures, and put them out, and then I saw a great tall figure come gliding by me, and when he came up to the light, I saw his great flaming eyes, and then I fell upon my knees, and he laid hold of my shoulder and griped it. Look, your honor, laying bare his shoulder as he spoke, and showing the deeply indented marks of the bony fingers of the mummy. Again a groan of horror and indignation ran through the court, and when another witness proved that the sarcophagus of Cheops had been examined, and was found empty, the judge seemed to think it was a clear case, and called triumphantly upon Edric for his defense. I do not see that what has been proved, said Edric, shuddering in spite of himself, can affect either my tutor or myself. These people say that a mummy has revived, and, quitting the pyramid in which he had been so long immured, has flown away with our balloon. But, supposing the tale to be true, what proof have you that we were at all implicated in the business? We were in the pyramid, it is true, but so was also this man, whom you have brought forward as a witness against us. Supposing it was the intervention of some human aid that roused the mummy from its tomb, a fact, by the way, by no means proved, why may not he be the agent instead of us? What is there to fix the charge against us? Have we gained anything by the adventure? Have we not, on the contrary, been serious losers by it? Where is our balloon, and the valuable articles it contained? If we are wizards, it must be confessed that we are very foolish ones, for we have lost our property, and thrown ourselves into prison, without reaping the smallest possible advantage. And if we have the power you seem to attribute to us, why do we stay here to be questioned, when we might so easily fly away in a flame of fire, or turn you all to statues, and walk quietly off without your being able to follow us? Everyone shuddered, and many turned pale at this speech, seeming to fear that Edric was about to put his suggestions into execution, whilst the judge seemed posed, and in vast perplexity as to what he had better determine, and the people were dreadfully afraid, lest they might, after all, lose the edifying spectacle of an auto da fe, for which they had been so impatiently longing. Edric marked the hesitation of the judge, and endeavored to improve it to his own advantage. For my part, continued he, I am a British subject, and as such, under the protection of my own court, my sovereign has a consul here, and to him I make my appeal. I am neither ignoble, nor unknown in my own country. My name is Montague, and I am brother to the celebrated general of that family, whose victories, no doubt, have reached even this remote province." "My dear Mr. Montague," said the judge, "I really beg your pardon. Why did you not acquaint me sooner with your dignity? I dare say there is no truth at all in the charge. Only assure me upon your honor that you did not touch the mummy, and that you know nothing of what is become of it at present, and I will instantly order you to be set at liberty." "I certainly do not know what is become of it," replied Edric. "But—" "No," interrupted Dr. Entwerfen, coming forward with the air of a determined martyr, "I will not suffer such equivocation. I would rather perish at the stake, than disavow, for a moment, my opinions, or betray the sacred interests of science with which I feel I am entrusted. No, sir. My pupil cannot make the public declaration you require. I know he would not, and he cannot if he would. On the contrary, I avow the fact. We came here for the express purpose of endeavoring to resuscitate the mummy of Cheops, and I glory in the proud thought that we have succeeded." A groan of horror. "Yes, sir, I do not hesitate to avow openly, that the grand object of my life, for several successive years, has been to detect in what consisted the strange, inexplicable secret of life. We live, sir, we die, we are born, and we are buried. We know that time, sickness, or violence, may kill us, but who can say in what the mysterious principle of life consists? Various theories have been broached, with which, no doubt, a gentleman of your intelligence and extensive information is well acquainted, and life has been successively stated to depend upon the heart, the brain, the circulation of the blood, and the respiration of the lungs. All, however, are fallacious. The heart has been wounded, and the brain has been removed, and yet the patient has lived, whilst the operations of respiration and circulation have been kept up for hours, in a body from which the vital spirit had departed. Weighing all these and divers other arguments in my mind, it has struck me, and indeed I may say, that after mature deliberation, I have confidently arrived at the conclusion, that both the faculties which we call life and soul depend entirely upon the nervous system. Do not all philosophers agree that we receive ideas merely through the medium of the senses? And can our senses be operated upon otherwise than through the influence of the nerves? Ergo, the nerves alone convey ideas and sensations to the mind, or rather, the nerves alone are the mind. Not a single instance, I believe, is known in which life remained after the sensorium had been destroyed, or even seriously injured. What then can be more simple than to suppose life resides there? Pursuing this idea, I have long been convinced that where the nervous system remained uninjured, and the appearance of death was only occasioned by a suspension of the operation of the animal functions, that life might be restored, if, by the intervention of any powerful agency, the nervous system could be excited to reaction, and as this, of course, could not be effected where any kind of decomposition had taken place. It appeared to me that a mummy was the only body upon which the experiment could be tried with the least prospect of success. From various circumstances, however, it has never till now been in my power to realize my wishes on this head, but for a few weeks past, my pupil has entertained similar longings to myself, and yesterday saw our hopes accomplished. Yes, I flatter myself there cannot now remain a shadow of doubt to the world, that, in ordinary cases, before decomposition has taken place, that resuscitation is not only possible, but probable, and that dead bodies may be easily restored to life. The horror and consternation produced by this extraordinary speech, amongst the Anglo-Egyptians who heard it, far exceeded any human powers of description. Their terror at what they considered as the doctor's daring impiety, being considerably augmented by their not understanding above 1/10 part of what he said, and when he had finished, there was a dead pause which no one dared to interrupt, till a sudden gust of wind happening to blow open the door of the justice's retiring room, the terrified crowd fell back aghast one upon another, pale and trembling, as though they absolutely expected his infernal majesty to appear before them in propria persona. When tranquillity was in some degree restored, the judge ordered the prisoners to be reconducted to prison. After the dangerous and impious speech we have just heard, said he, "it would be madness to trust such suspected persons at large, and yet, I would willingly take time to consider the case, and to ascertain whether this young man be indeed the person he represents himself, as, I own, I should be sorry to inflict the full penalty of the law upon the brother of Her Britannic Majesty's Commander-in-Chief." Remonstrance was useless, and the prisoners were again conducted to their dungeon where they were heavily chained, and left to ruminate upon the calamities that had befallen them. Far from agreeable were these meditations, for Edric was too angry with the doctor's ill-timed candor to be inclined to speak, and the doctor was too much ashamed of the effect already produced by his eloquence, to wish to make any farther display of it. At length, as his eyes became accustomed to the faint glimmering light admitted into the dungeon, he perceived the wall to which he was chained was covered with hieroglyphics, and endeavored to divert his chagrin by examining them. "I congratulate you, sir," said Edric, when he perceived this, feeling rather indignant at his tutor's coolness. "I congratulate you most sincerely upon your philosophy, and most earnestly do I wish that I could imitate it." "Ah, Edric," returned the doctor, "all men are not equally gifted with either the art of making blunders, or forgetting them," said Edric pointedly. "These hieroglyphics are very curious," observed the doctor, who had his own reasons for not wishing to pursue the subject. "See how beautifully the ancient Egyptians worked in granite. The fine polish they contrived to give this hard substance would be perfectly astonishing, if we did not recollect that they always edged their tools with emerald dust." "Humph," said Edric, in a tone which seemed to imply, "and what does it matter to me if they did?" The doctor, however, was unabashed, and continued, "You see, as usual, the figure of the bull is frequently repeated here. This wall is evidently built of stones gathered from some ancient ruin. By the way, Edric, I don't think I ever explained to you why the ancient Egyptians chose a bull as one of their deities, or, rather, as their principal one. You know, that anciently the year began in Taurus, though, by the precession of the equinox, it has now advanced past Aries. Well, as the ancient Egyptians found that the sun began its career in Taurus, what could be more natural than that they should identify a bull with the vivifying principle? The same theory may account for that legend of the Chaldeans, which supposes the world to have been produced by a bull striking chaos with his horn, which horn, by the way, was probably the origin of the fable of Amalthea, or the horn of plenty." Edric made no reply, and the doctor, dreading a pause, which might give his pupil an opportunity of upbraiding him, went on. "Though the Egyptians had a number of divinities, they clearly worshipped only two, viz. the principles of good and evil. Osiris, Isis, Kneph, Thoth, Horus, and all their host of inferior deities, were clearly types of the first, and light and life were their essence, whilst Typhon, Campsa, and the malignant deities, exemplified the second, and their attributes were invariably darkness and death." "For heaven's sake," cried Edric, "say no more upon the subject, for it is not in the power of language to describe the horror I have at the mere thought of anything Egyptian. Let us escape from this fearful country, and I most sincerely hope nothing may ever happen to recall even its recollection to my imagination. Such and so changeable are the desires of human life," said the doctor. "But a few short weeks since, Egypt was the goal of your wishes, and the prospect of reanimating a corpse." "Oh! Do not mention it," cried Edric, shuddering. "O God! How justly am I punished, by the very fulfillment of my unhallowed hopes. Even now the fearful eyes of that hideous mummy seem to glare upon me, and even now I feel the gripe of its horrid bony fingers on my arm." "Oh yes, no doubt," exclaimed the doctor, "he pinched hard. He was a king, and kings should have strong arms, you know." "For God's sake, do not jest upon such a subject," returned Edric, "a subject so wild and fearful, that I can still scarcely believe but that all which has passed was a dream." "If it be," said the doctor, "it is one from which I freely avow I should be very happy to awake, for I must confess this prison is not at all to my taste." "And yet, is it not your fault?" began Edric. "Recrimination, Edric, is always folly," interrupted the doctor, who did not now feel very proud of the part he had acted before the magistrate, nor very anxious to have it alluded to, and instead of losing time in regretting past errors, it is the part of a wise man to endeavor to find means of remedying them, and avoiding them in future. Agreed, returned Edric, and as I presume you are now convinced your learned dissertation on the probable seat of human life was, to say the least, ill-timed, we will drop the subject. But, even if we get out of prison, what is to become of us? Our money and valuables were all in the balloon, and here we are, in a foreign country, entirely destitute. Not entirely, Edric, not entirely, cried the doctor, a glow of satisfaction spreading itself again over his face. No, no, I have guarded against that. Ah, what a thing it is to have foresight. Well, some persons are certainly singularly gifted in that line, and it is a happy thing for you that you have somebody to think for you. See here, displaying the things as he spoke, here is a bed, bolster, and pillows, ready for inflation, a portable bedstead, linen, soap, pens, ink, paper, candles, fire, knives, forks, spoons, and money, all snugly packed up in my walking stick. Your supporter, returned Edric, smiling, as you used to call it, and as it now seems likely to prove, in more senses than one. Yes, yes, cried the doctor, let us only get out of prison, and all the rest will be easy. But that only, doctor. Of that we must take time to consider. Well, it is some comfort that we are likely to be allowed time enough, as my hint respecting the British consul did not seem thrown away upon the judge. Oh, doctor, if you had not spoken. Why, surely you would not have given him the declaration he required? There was no occasion. He neither wished nor expected more than I had already said. After what I had mentioned of my family, he only wished a decent pretext for setting us at liberty. At any rate, said the doctor, by way of changing the subject, you see my doctrine is proved completely by the resuscitation of the mummy, for it must have been perfectly restored to life and consciousness, or it could not have flown away with the balloon. For my part, returned Edric, I can scarcely believe what has occurred to be real. There must be some deception. And yet, by whom can a deception have been practiced, and for what purpose? In short, I am quite bewildered. The doctor, being much in the same condition, could only sympathize with his pupil, and in this state we must leave them, whilst we inquire respecting the mysterious object of their speculations. The mummy thus strangely recalled to life, was indeed Cheops. And horrible were the sensations that throbbed through every nerve as returning consciousness brought with it all the pangs of his former existence, and renewed circulation thrilled through every vein. His first impulse was to quit the tomb in which he had been so long immured, and seek again the regions of light and day. Instinct seemed to guide him to this, for, as yet, a mist hung over his faculties, and ideas thronged in painful confusion through his mind, which he was incapable of either arranging or analyzing. When however he reached the plain, light and air seemed to revive him and restore his scattered senses, and gazing wildly around he exclaimed, "Where am I? What place is this? Methinks all seems wondrous, new, and strange. Where is my father? And where? Oh, where is my Arsinoe? Alas, alas," continued he wildly, "I had forgotten. I hoped it was a dream, a fearful dream, for methinks I have been long asleep. Was it, indeed, reality? Are all gone? And was that hideous scene true, those horrors that still haunt my memory like a ghastly vision? Speak! Speak!" continued he, his voice rising in thrilling energy as he spoke. "Speak! Let me hear the sound of another's voice, before my brain is lost in madness. Have I entered Hades, or am I still on earth? Yes, yes, it is still the earth, for there the mighty pyramid, I caused to be erected, towers behind me. Yet where is Memphis? Where my forts and palaces? What a dark, smoky mass of buildings now surrounds me. Can this be the once proud queen of cities? Oh, no. I see no palaces, no temples, Memphis is fallen. The mighty barrier that protected her splendor from the waste of waters must have been swept away by the encroaching inroads of the swelling Nile. But is this the Nile, continued he, looking wildly upon the river, sure I must be deceived. It is the fatal river of the dead. No Papyrine boats glide smoothly on its surface, but strange, infernal vessels, vomiting forth volumes of fire and smoke. Holy Osiris, defend me. Where am I? Where have I been? A misty veil seems thrown upon the face of nature. Awake, awake, cried he, with a scream of agony, set me free, I did not mean to slay him. Then throwing himself violently upon the ground, he lay for some moments, apparently insensible. Then slowly rising, he looked at himself, and a deep, unnatural shuddering convulsed his whole frame. His sensations of identity became confused, and he recoiled with horror from himself. These are the trappings of a mummy, murmured he in a hollow whisper. Am I then dead? The next instant, however, he broke into a wild laugh of derision. Poor, feeble wretch, cried he, what do I fear, need? I tremble, in whose bosom dwells everlasting fire. No, no. Let me rather rejoice. I cannot be more wretched, why then should I dread a change? I should rather welcome it with transport, and bravely dare my fate. At this moment the car of the balloon caught his eye. Ah! What is that? Cried he, I am summoned. 'Tis the boat of Hecate, ready to ferry me across the Marian lake, to learn my final doom. I come. I come. I fear no judgment. My hell is here, and, striking his bosom, leaped into the car, and stamped violently against its sides. At this instant Gregory awoke. His terror was not surprising. The dried, distorted features of the mummy looked yet more hideous than before, when animated by human passions, and his deep hollow voice, speaking in a language he did not understand, fell heavily upon his ear, like the groans of fiends. Gregory tried to scream, but he could not utter a sound. He attempted to fly, but his feet seemed nailed to the spot on which he stood, and he remained with his eyes fixed upon the mummy, gasping for breath, while a cold sweat distilled from every pore. In the meantime, Cheops had stumbled over the box containing the apparatus for making inflammable air, and striking it violently, had unintentionally set the machinery in motion. The pipes, tubes, and bellows instantly began to work, and the Indian rubber bottle became gradually inflated, till it swelled to an enormous magnitude, and fluttered in the air like an imprisoned bird, beating itself against the massive walls to which it was still attached. Still it goes not, cried Cheops, again stamping impatiently. The quicksilver vapor bottle had fallen beneath his feet, and it broke as he trod upon it. The vapor burst from it with inconceivable violence, and tearing the balloon from its fastenings, sent it off through the air, like an arrow darting from a bow. Chapter 11. In the meantime, Sir Ambrose Montague had been presented to the Queen, and the evening after his arrival in town he attended her drawing-room. The splendor of the English court at this period defies description. The walls of the room in which the Queen received her guest were literally one blaze of precious stones, and these being disposed in the form of bouquets, wreaths, and trophies, were so contrived as to quiver with every movement. These magnificent walls were relieved by a colonnade of pillars of solid gold, around which were twined wreaths of jewels fixed also upon elastic gold wires, so as to tremble every instant. The throne of the Queen was formed of gold filigree beautifully wrought, richly chased, and superbly ornamented, whilst behind it was an immense plate of looking-glass, stretching the whole length and height of the apartment, and giving the whole the effect of a fairy palace. The carpet spread upon the floor of this sumptuous saloon was so exact an imitation of green moss, with exquisitely beautiful groups of flowers thrown carelessly upon it, that a heedless spectator might have been completely deceived by the delicacy of their shape and richness of their coloring, and have stooped to pick them up, supposing them to be real. The suite of rooms appropriated to dancing was equally splendid, and fitted up in the same manner, save that the floors were painted to imitate the effect of the carpet, and rows of trees were placed on each side, hung with lamps. This imitative grove was so exquisitely managed that the spectator could scarcely believe it artificial, and the music for dancing proceeded from its leaves, or from automaton birds placed carelessly amongst its branches. The dresses of the queen and her attendants were worthy of the apartment they occupied. Brocaded silks, cloth of gold, embroidered velvets, gold and silver tissues, and gossamer nets made of the spider's web, were mingled with precious stones and superb plumes of feathers in a profusion quite beyond description. The most beautiful of the female habiliments, however, were robes made of woven asbestos, which glittered in the brilliant light like molten silver. The ladies were all arrayed in loose trousers, over which hung drapery in graceful folds, and most of them carried on their heads streams of lighted gas forced by capillary tubes into plumes, fleur-de-lis, or in short any form the wearer pleased, which jets to few had an uncommonly chaste and elegant effect. The gentlemen were all clothed in the Spanish style, with slashed sleeves, short cloaks, and large hats, ornamented with immense plumes of ostrich feathers, it being considered in those days extremely vulgar to appear with the head uncovered. It would, perhaps, have been difficult to imagine more perfect models of male and female beauty than those which now adorned the court of Queen Claudia, for the beau ideal of the painter's fancy seemed realized, nay surpassed by the noble living figures there collected. The women were particularly lovely, and as they stood gathered round their queen, or lightly threaded the mazes of the graceful dance, dressed as above described, their brows bound with circlets of precious stones, and their glossy hair hanging in rich luxuriant ringlets upon their ivory shoulders, they looked like a group of houris, or the nymphs of Circe, ready with sparkling eyes and witching voices to lure men to destruction. Claudia was very handsome, and though her countenance wanted expression, her noble figure and majestic bearing well qualified her to play her part as queen amongst this bevy of beauties, with becoming dignity. There is something in the habit of command, when it has been long enjoyed, that gives an imposing majesty to the manner, which the parvenu great strive in vain to imitate, and Claudia had this in perfection. The consciousness of beauty, power, and high birth swelled in her bosom, and even when she wished to be affable, she was only condescending. She now, however, received Sir Ambrose most graciously. She gave him her snowy hand to kiss, and addressed a few words of compliment to him, which sank deep into his heart. It is one of the privileges of greatness easily to excite emotion. One word of commendation from those above us far outweighs all the labored flattery of our inferiors. Thus the words of Claudia, and the warm praise she bestowed on Edmund, gave the purest transport to his father's heart, and affected him so violently, that he would have fallen at her feet, had he not been supported by a young man who stood near him. "You seem faint, sir," said the youth. "Will you permit me to lead you to a seat?" Thank you," cried Sir Ambrose, gratefully accepting the proffered aid, and leaning on his youthful supporter as they left the presence. The stranger carefully placed Sir Ambrose upon a sofa, under the harmonious trees we have already mentioned, and as he stood before him, asking if he should procure him some refreshments, Sir Ambrose had full leisure to survey his face and figure. Both were handsome in the extreme. The youth seemed scarcely to have passed the age of boyhood, and his well-proportioned form displayed all the lightness and activity of youth, but wit and good humor laughed in his bright blue eyes, whilst animated features and an enchanting smile completed an ensemble which few bosoms were frozen enough to resist. Sir Ambrose was irresistibly pleased, and longed to know to whom he was indebted for so much kindness. But he felt too delicate to ask the question in direct terms, and there was nothing in the youth's exterior to mark decidedly to what rank in life he might belong. He was handsomely dressed, and his air and manner appeared slightly foreign, though this might be fancy, arising from Sir Ambrose's ignorance of the manners and habits of the court. There also seemed something droll about him, and the air with which he submitted to Sir Ambrose's scrutiny was excessively comic. "Is there anything I can do for you?" asked he at length, when he thought the baronet's curiosity had had time to satisfy itself. "Nothing," replied Sir Ambrose, but you would like to know who I am," said the stranger. I own, returned Sir Ambrose, blushing, I would fain know to whom I am so much obliged. My name is Henry Seymour, replied the youth. I was born in Spain, of English parents. I am an orphan and in want, and have been introduced to the Queen, in hopes of getting a place at court, by one of Her Majesty's physicians, Dr. Coleman. I am quite ashamed, said Sir Ambrose, that my indiscreet curiosity, that is, that you should have thought, that I should have asked for. In short, interrupted the youth, you think, perhaps, that I meant to call you rude by giving such a long account of myself, but I always do so in similar cases, it saves trouble. Sir Ambrose smiled. You are a singular youth, said he, I should like to know you better. And I, returned the stranger, should be proud to obtain the friendship of Sir Ambrose Montague, and shall always reckon the day that introduced me to his notice, as one of the happiest of my life. A glow of pleasure spread over the animated features of the youth as he spoke, and Sir Ambrose fancied his accent sounded slightly Irish. Convinced, however, that he must be mistaken, he did not remark it, but only exclaimed, You know me, then? Before the stranger had time to utter a reply, the Duke of Cornwall, and the Princesses Rosabella and Elvira approached, and prevented him from speaking. How do you find yourself, my dear friend, said the Duke, they told us you were ill. I have been slightly so, returned Sir Ambrose, and I believe I should have fainted, and paid my respects to my sovereign quite orientally, if this gentleman had not saved me. I am sure we are very much obliged to you, sir, said the Duke, turning to the youth. Indeed, we feel most grateful, said Elvira. The stranger made a suitable reply, and after a short conversation, in which Dr. Coleman joined, that worthy gentleman having been also drawn to the spot by the report of Sir Ambrose's illness, he requested the favour of Elvira's hand for the dance. That is a very nice young man, said the Duke, when he was gone to join the dancers, I admire him much. He deserves everything you can say in his favour, returned Dr. Coleman, I have known him long, and I love him as a son. When Elvira retired to her chamber that night, she sighed so often, and so deeply, that Emma, who assisted at her toilet, could not avoid remarking her uneasiness. Are you ill, my dear mistress? Asked she, in a tone of feeling, what else can have produced this sudden change? I am quite well, said Elvira, again sighing. Why then do you sigh and look so thoughtful? I was thinking of Lord Edmund. Indeed. I did not think he had the power to make you sigh. He has reason to feel flattered. Oh, Emma. I wish he were like Henry Seymour. And who is Henry Seymour? Asked Emma, smiling, and beginning to suspect that she had been rather hasty in fancying Lord Edmund had occasion to flatter himself on account of the princess's tristesse. One of the most fascinating of human beings, returned Elvira, so gay, and yet so tender. He is not, perhaps, so regularly handsome as Edmund, but he has such expressive features, and his soul gives such animation to his countenance. Poor Edmund, thought Emma, but as she was too discreet to say so, Elvira was not aware of the interpretation that might be put on what she was saying, and she went on, raving of the pleasures of the ball, till she was fairly in bed. The following day was appointed for the triumphal entry of Lord Edmund, and the greatest part of the night preceding it was passed by Sir Ambrose in the greatest agitation. He could not sleep, he rose several times from his bed, in excessive anxiety, to listen for the repetition of noises which he fancied he heard. Once he opened his window, all was still. His room looked into the garden of Mr. Montague, which, as we have already mentioned, shelved down to the Thames, and the calm moonlight slept peacefully upon the tall, thick trees, and verdant lawn that spread before him. The evening breeze felt cool and refreshing, but Sir Ambrose sighed, and a strange fear of something he could not wholly define hung over him. He again retired to bed, and at length sank into a feverish and uneasy doze. At daybreak, however, a thundering of cannon announced the arrival of the important day. Sir Ambrose started from his pillow at the first discharge, and the solemn sound thrilled through every nerve as it pealed along the sky. Scarcely had its echoes died upon the ear, when another, and another peal succeeded, and the heart of Sir Ambrose throbbed in his bosom almost to suffocation, as he sate, resting his head upon his hands, and striving, though ineffectually, to stop his ears from the solemn sound, which seemed to absorb his every faculty, and strike almost with the force of a blow upon his nerves. Whilst he was still in this position, Father Morris entered the room. "Come, come, Sir Ambrose," cried he, "are you not ready? The Queen has sent for us, and the procession is just ready to set off." Sir Ambrose started. He attempted to dress himself, but his trembling hands refused to perform their office, and Father Morris and Abelard were obliged to attire him, and lead him down to join his friend, the Duke, who was waiting for him impatiently. It has often been said that the anticipation of pleasure is always greater than the reality. This, however, was not the case in the present instance, as the brilliancy of Lord Edmund's triumph was far greater than even the imaginations of the spectators had before dared to conceive. The Duke and Sir Ambrose, attended by Father Morris, found the individuals who were to compose the procession of the Queen assembled in the extensive gardens belonging to the superb palace of Somerset House. These fine gardens, spreading their verdant groves along the banks of the river, adorned by all the charms of nature and art, and enriched by some of the finest specimens of sculpture in the world, were now crowded with all the beauty and rank of England, who, waiting for the arrival of their sovereign, formed an ensemble no other nation in the world could hope to imitate. In the centre walk, appeared the superb Arabian charger of the Queen, led by his grooms, and magnificently caparisoned. His bridle was studded with precious stones, and his hoofs cased in gold, whilst his blue satin saddle and housings were richly embroidered and fringed with the same metal. The noble animal, whose flowing manner and tail swept the ground, paced proudly along, tossing his head on high, and spurning the ground on which he trod, as though conscious he should perform a conspicuous part in the grand pageant about to take place. All now was ready, but yet Queen Claudia did not appear. "It is very strange, but lately it is always so," said Lord Maysworth to Lord Gustavus de Montfort, who had been for some time engaged in earnest conversation with Father Morris. Lord Gustavus started at the sound of his friend's voice in some apparent confusion, whilst Father Morris replied in his usual soft, insinuating tones, "Perhaps Her Majesty may be indisposed, and have slept rather longer than usual." "Most likely," returned Lord Maysworth, "yet it is strange the same thing should happen so often. If you remember," continued he, again addressing Lord Gustavus, "I made the same observation the morning of her last levee. Indeed I have frequently made it lately, and I have observed that she looks pale and languid. Here she comes, at any rate. And for my part, I think I never saw her look better," said Dr. Hardman, who had now joined them, and who, notwithstanding his violent politics, was one of the physicians of the court. The indolence of Claudia, which, indeed, seemed daily increasing, having induced her to overlook what another sovereign would have resented. Claudia did indeed look well, and her dress suited well with her style of beauty. Her trousers and vest were of pale blue satin, whilst over her shoulders was thrown a long flowing drapery of asbestos silk, which hanging in graceful folds, swept the ground as she walked along, shining in the sun like a robe of woven silver. On her head, she wore a splendid tiara of diamonds, and in her hand, she bore the regal scepter, surmounted by a dove, and richly ornamented with precious stones. Thus gorgeously attired, surrounded by the ladies of her household, she issued from her palace, and whilst her kneeling subjects bent in humble homage around her, she mounted her noble charger. Cannon were now fired in rapid succession, the bells of every church rang in merry peals, and martial music mingled in the clamour. The palace gates were thrown open, and the procession poured from them along the streets, where crowds of human beings bustled to and fro, eager to catch a glimpse of the sumptuous spectacle. First advanced a long double line of monks, arrayed in sacerdotal pomp, and bearing immensely thick lighted tapers in their hands, chanting thanksgiving for the victory. They were followed by chorister boys, flinging incense from silver vases that hung suspended by chains in their hands, and chanting also, their shrill trebles mingling with the deep bass voices of the priests in rich and mellow harmony. The queen next appeared, her prancing charger led by grooms, whilst beautiful girls, elegantly attired, walked on each side of their sovereign, scattering flowers in her path from fancy baskets made of wrought gold. Behind the queen rode the ladies of her household and the principal nobles of her court, the superb plumes of ostrich feathers in the large Spanish hats of the latter, with their immense mustachios and open shirt collars, giving them the air of some of Van Dyck's best pictures. As they rode slowly along, their noble Arabians paced proudly and champed the bit, impatient of restraint. The ladies of the court, superbly dressed in open litters, next appeared, borne upon the shoulders of men splendidly clad in rich liveries. Amongst these were Elvira and Rosabella. These were followed by monks and boys as before, but singing a somewhat different strain. It was now a chant of glory and triumph that swelled upon the ear, for these preceded the Duke and Sir Ambrose, who, the one as uncle to the Queen, and the other as father of the expected hero, occupied the post of honor. The two venerable old men sate hand in hand in a sumptuous car drawn by 2 Arabian horses, and were followed by a large body of the Queen's guards. The costliness and variety of the dresses worn this day were quite beyond description. Many of the ladies had turbans of woven glass, whilst others carried on their hats very pretty fountains made of glass dust, which, being thrown up in little jets by a small perpetual motion wheel, sparkled in the sun like real water, and had a very singular effect. In this manner the procession advanced towards Blackheath Square, said to be the largest and finest in the world, where the meeting between the Queen and her general was appointed to take place. Amongst the numerous balloons that floated in the air, enjoying this magnificent spectacle, was one containing Father Murphy, who had been prevented, by a sprained ankle, from joining in the procession, and the family of Mr. Montague, and nothing could be more enthusiastic than their delight, as they looked down upon the splendid scene below them. Few things, indeed, could be imagined finer than the sight of this gorgeous cortege, winding slowly along a magnificent street, supposed to be 5 miles long, leading from Blackfriars Bridge, through Greenwich, to Blackheath. Sumptuous rows of houses, or rather palaces, lined the sides of this superb street, the terraces and balconies before which were crowded with persons of all ages, beautifully attired, waving flags of different colors, richly embroidered and fringed with gold, whilst festoons of the choicest flowers hung from house to house. We have already said the air was thronged with balloons, and the crowd increased every moment. These aerial machines, loaded with spectators till they were in danger of breaking down, glittered in the sun, and presented every possible variety of shape and color. In fact, every balloon in London or the vicinity had been put in requisition, and enormous sums paid, in some cases, merely for the privilege of hanging to the cords that attached the cars, whilst the innumerable multitudes that thus loaded the air amused themselves by scattering flowers upon the heads of those who rode beneath. Besides balloons, however, a variety of other modes of conveyance fluttered in the sky. Some dandies bestrode aerial horses, inflated with inflammable gas, whilst others floated upon wings, or glided gently along, reclining gracefully upon aerial sledges, the last being contrived so as to cover a sufficient column of air for their support. As the procession approached the river, the scene became still more animated. Innumerable barges of every kind and description shot swiftly along, or glided smoothly over the sparkling water. Some floated with the tide in large boat-like shoes, whilst others, reclining on couch-shaped cars, formed of mother of pearl, were drawn forward by inflated figures representing the deities or monsters of the deep. When the Queen reached a spot near Greenwich, where, through a spacious opening, the river, in all its glorious majesty, burst upon her, she paused, and commanded her trumpeters to advance and sound a flourish. They obeyed, and after a short pause were answered by those of Lord Edmund, the sound, mellowed by the distances, pealing along the water in dulcet harmony. Delighted with this response, which announced the arrival of Lord Edmund and his troops at the appointed place, the procession of the Queen was again set in motion, and in a short time arrived at Blackheath. The noble square in which the meeting was to take place was already thronged with soldiers, whilst every house that surrounded it was covered with spectators. No trees or fantastical ornaments spoiled the simple grandeur of this immense space. The houses that surrounded it, built in exact uniformity, each having a peristyle supported by Corinthian pillars, and a highly decorated facade, looked like so many Athenian temples. As the cortege of the Queen entered the square, the soldiers formed an opening to receive it, and reverentially knelt on each side, with reversed arms, and bending banners as she passed. In the centre was Lord Edmund, surrounded by his staff, all in polished armour, for since an invention had been discovered of rendering steel perfectly flexible, it had been generally used in war. Lord Edmund's helmet, however, was thrown off, and his fine countenance was displayed to the greatest advantage, as he and his officers threw themselves from their war steeds to kneel before the Queen. Claudia, also, descended from her charger, and as she stood in her glittering robes, surrounded on all sides by her kneeling subjects, she looked, indeed, their sovereign. With becoming dignity, she addressed a few words of thanks and commendation to Lord Edmund, as he knelt before her, his thick, dark, brown hair falling in clustering curls over his noble forehead. His graceful figure was shown to the utmost advantage, by his closely fitting armour, over which, however, upon the present occasion was thrown a short cloak of fine scarlet cloth, richly embroidered with gold, and fastened in front by a cord and superb tassels, made entirely of the same metal. He looked a living personification of the god of war. The Queen raised him from the ground in the most gracious manner, and then turning to the still kneeling soldiers, she made a short speech to them, of the same nature as that which she had addressed to Lord Edmund, after which, again mounting her palfrey, she made Lord Edmund ride by her side, and prepared to return to town. Edmund's quick eye had discovered, and exchanged looks of affection with his father and friends, though the etiquette of his present situation did not permit him to do more, and he now rode proudly by the side of the Queen, gracefully bowing to the assembled crowd as he passed along, his heart beating with pleasure at the thought that his triumph was witnessed by those most dear to him, whilst his noble Arabian tossed his head and champed his bit as he pranced forward, as though he also knew the part he was performing in the splendid ceremony. Acclamations rent the sky as the procession advanced, and showers of roses were rained down upon the Queen and her general from the balloons above, from which, also, flags waved in graceful folds, and flapped in the wind, as the balloons floated along the sky. Every one seemed delighted with the grandeur of this splendid pageant, but no one experienced more pleasure than the occupiers of the balloon of Mr. Montague. Even that oblivious gentleman himself was moved to exclaim, that he never was more enchanted in his life, whilst the raptures of his spouse were so excessive, that, like the spectators of the stag hunt on the lake of Killarney, she was in imminent danger of throwing herself overboard in her ecstasy, and Clara clasped her hands together, in all the transports of childish delight, her sparkling eyes and animated looks bearing ample witness to her gratification. "What shouting! What a noise!" exclaimed Mr. Montague. "I declare it puts me in mind of the acclamations in the time of Nero, when the Romans shouted in concert, and birds fell from the skies with the noise." "La! Papa, is that true?" asked Clara. "Ark, and that's a strange kind of a question," said Father Murphy, "and one I wouldn't like a child of mine to be putting." "And why not?" asked Mr. Montague, somewhat indignantly. "Because a child ought always to believe what his father says, before he hears him open his mouth." "How well the Queen looks," observed Mrs. Montague, to whom the Reverend Father's remark was far from agreeable. It was said a short time since, that she had lost her appetite and could get no rest, but I think she doesn't seem to have much the matter with her now. "My nurse says she's being poisoned," cried Clara, "and that it would be no great matter if she was, for then the people would have to choose a queen for themselves, and they might make what terms they pleased with her." "And is this the kind of servant you suffer to attend on my daughter, Mrs. Montague?" demanded the indignant father, roused from his usual lethargy by the importance of the occasion. "Clara shall go to a boarding school tomorrow, and her nurse shall be dismissed. My child shall not be taught to utter treason." "Dear me, Mr. Montague," replied the wife, "what a serious matter you make of a little harmless gossip." "Gossip do you call it?" repeated her husband. "It is such gossip as might cost me my head, and you your fortune, if it were to reach unfriendly ears." An awkward pause followed this speech, which no one seemed inclined to break, till Clara exclaimed, "Dear me! What a pretty horse my cousin Edmund rides!" "I think that's a prettier that comes after him," said Father Murphy. "What, that one with his head hanging down and his maness sweeping the ground?" asked Mrs. Montague. "Yes, and it's a very handsome young man also, that walks by the side of him," replied Father Murphy. "His hands are chained as if he were a prisoner, and he looks like a foreigner," observed Mr. Montague, who had relapsed into one of his fits of abstraction. "I wonder what can bring him there." "La! Mr. Montague, how you talk," exclaimed his wife. "You know my nephew Lord Edmund has just gained a battle, and what can be more natural than that he should have taken prisoners?" "True," rejoined Mr. Montague with the utmost naivete, "I never thought of that." "Ark, and it's a barbarous custom that of putting chains about the hands of the prisoners," said Father Murphy, as if it was not bad enough to be a prisoner without looking like one. "Poor fellow," cried Clara, "I should like to go and let him loose. He looks very melancholy." "How great my nephew Lord Edmund looks," continued Mrs. Montague. "I declare it, he were a real king he couldn't have a grander appearance. And then to see the poor old gentleman his father, my brother-in-law, Sir Ambrose, sitting there hand in hand with the Duke of Cornwall himself, I declare it does my heart good to look at them." Whilst Mrs. Montague was thus exulting in the reflected grandeur that shone upon her, from being sister-in-law to the person who sat hand in hand with the Duke, the joy and delight of that exalted personage had been almost as great as her own. His impatience during the whole procession from London had been excessive, and the moment he saw Edmund, he rubbed his hands in ecstasy, and jumping up in his seat almost overturned Sir Ambrose, who was also bending forward eagerly gazing upon his son. There he is," cried the Duke. "Look how handsome he is. Oh, the young rogue! There'll be many a heart lost today, I warrant me. Look at him, how the colour comes into his cheeks as the Queen speaks to him. Look! Now he helps her on her horse, and now see, he's looking round for us. There, I caught his eye, see, Sir Ambrose. Don't you see him? Surely you aren't he crying, my old friend? Why, you'll make me as great a fool as yourself, God bless him. I am sure I don't know anything we have to cry at, but we are two old simpletons." Father Maurice, who had joined the procession of monks, was almost as much affected as his patron. Indeed, his affection for Edmund seemed the only human passion remaining in his ascetic breast. Cold even to frigidity in his exterior, Father Maurice seemed to regard the scenes passing around him but as the moving figures of a magic lantern, which glittered for a moment in glowing colors, and then vanished into darkness, leaving no trace behind, whilst he, unmoved as the wall over which the gaudy but shadowy pageant had passed, saw them alternately vanish and reappear without the slightest emotion being excited in his mind. Under this statue-like appearance, however, Father Maurice concealed passions as terrific as those which might be supposed to throb in the breast of a demon, though never did his self-command seem relaxed for a moment, but when the interests of Edmund were in question. On the present occasion, however, joy swelled in his bosom almost to suffocation, as he raised his eyes to heaven, and, wringing his hands together, exclaimed, "Oh! It is too much." There is something indescribably affecting in seeing strong emotion expressed by those who are generally calm and unimpassioned, and Sir Ambrose, by whom this burst of feeling from his confessor was quite unexpected, gazed at him with the utmost surprise, and, strange to tell, though the monk had now lived nearly 20 years under his roof, it was the first time he had seen his head completely uncovered. Father Morris's cowl had now, however, fallen off entirely, and displayed the head of a man between 40 and 50, whose fine features bore the traces of what he had endured. His noble expressive brow seemed wrinkled more by care than age, and his sable locks had evidently become grizzled here and there, prematurely. Sir Ambrose gazed upon him intently, for the peculiar expression of his features seemed to recall some half-forgotten circumstance to his mind, dimly obscured, however, by the mist of time. The earnestness with which he consequently regarded the monk seemed at length to recall the latter to himself. He started, and, whilst a deep crimson flushed his usually sallow countenance, he hastily resumed his cowl, and appeared again to the eyes of the spectators, the same cold, unimpassioned, abstracted being as before. The ovation had now nearly reached Blackfriars Bridge, at the entrance to which a triumphal arch had been erected. The moment the Queen and her heroic general passed under it, a small figure of fame was contrived to descend from its entablature, and, hovering over the hero, to drop a laurel crown upon his head. Shouts of applause followed this well-executed device, and the passengers in the balloons, wondering at the noise, all pressed forward at the same moment to ascertain the cause of such continued acclamations. The throng of balloons became thus every instant more dense. Some young city apprentices having hired each a pair of wings for the day, and not exactly knowing how to manage them, a dreadful tumult ensued, and the balloons became entangled with the winged heroes and each other in inextricable confusion. The noise now became tremendous, the conductors of the balloons swearing at each other the most refined oaths, and the ladies screaming in concert. Several balloons were rent in the scuffle and fell with tremendous force upon the earth, whilst some cars were torn from their supporting ropes, and others roughly overset. Luckily, however, the whole of England was at this time so completely excavated, that falling upon the surface of the earth was like tumbling upon the parchment of an immense drum, and consequently only a deep hollow sound was returned as cargo after cargo of the demolished balloons struck upon it. Some of them, indeed, rebounded several yards with the violence of the shock. Amongst those who fell from the greatest height, and of course rebounded most violently, were the unfortunate individuals who composed the party of Mr. Montague, an unlucky apprentice having poked his right wing through the silk of their balloon, in endeavouring to avoid the charge of an aerial horseman, who found his Aeolian steed too difficult to manage in the confusion. The car containing our friends was in consequence precipitated to earth so rapidly, as for the moment to deprive them of breath. "Ark, and I'm killed entirely," cried Father Murphy. "Oh, my bonnet! My beautiful bonnet," sobbed Mrs. Montague, whilst Clara, dreadfully frightened, began to cry, and Mr. Montague, whose ideas were generally a long time travelling to his brain, particularly upon occasions of sudden alarm, stood completely silent, stupidly gazing about him, as though he had not the least notion what could possibly have happened. Indeed, it was not till a full hour afterwards, that he found himself sufficiently recovered to exclaim, "Dear me! I do think we were very near being killed." In the meantime, the confusion in the air still continued, piercing screams that demons were in the air, mingled horribly with the crashing of balloons, the cries of the sufferers, and the successive falling of heavy weights. The situation of the crowd below, however, was infinitely worse than that of those above. The momentum of the falling bodies being fearfully increased by the distance they had to descend, those below had no chance of escape, and were inevitably crushed to death by their weight, whilst the agonizing shrieks of the unfortunate wretches who saw their danger coming from a distance, yet were so jammed together in the crowd that they could not fly, rang shrilly upon the ear, and pierced through every heart. At this moment a dreadful scream ran through the crowd, and the horse of Queen Claudia, his bridle broken, his housings torn, his nostrils distended, and his sides streaming with gore, rushed past. "Oh God! The Queen! The Queen!" burst from every voice, and one general rush took place towards the spot from whence the cry had proceeded. Beneath the triumphal arch, and partially sheltered by its shade, lay the bleeding body of Claudia, supported by Edmund. By her side knelt Rosabella, who, assisted by Father Morris, was applying restoratives, whilst Henry Seymour was endeavouring to restore Elvira, who had fainted in the arms of her father, and Sir Ambrose, his face streaming with blood, stood at a little distance amongst a group of courtiers, several of whom had also experienced severe injuries. The tumult in the air still continued. Groans and shrieks and exclamations, that the atmosphere was supernaturally haunted, were heard in many places, and some persons declared the accident to be the work of demons. A current of wind had blown those balloons that had become unmanageable across the city, while the others, terrified almost to madness, appeared still contending with some fearful monster in the sky. The courtiers, however, heeded not this disturbance, for all their attention was occupied by the apparently expiring queen, whose long-drawn sighs, and convulsed bosom, seemed to threaten her instant dissolution. "She's gone," cried Lord Gustavus de Montfort, as her bosom heaved with a deep, heavy sigh, and then all was still. "Yes, she's dead," repeated Lord Noodle. "She is certainly dead," reiterated Lord Doodle. And then these sapient counsellors of the apparently departed queen shook their wise heads in sympathy. "Hush! She breathes," cried Lord Edmund. For some moments, the courtiers stood in breathless anxiety watching the body, and fearing to move lest they should break the awful silence that prevailed, though their hearts throbbed till the pulsations were almost audible. Fearful was the pause that now ensued. All were suffering from the torments of hope or fear, for all knew that the interests of the whole community hung upon her breath. Most of the courtiers also either hoped to gain places, or feared to lose them, whilst all trembled at the uncertainty that seemed to rest upon their future destiny, and the prospect of the anarchy which the purposed mode of electing their future sovereign might create. The interest which the fate of the queen excited was thus intense, and the courtiers hung over her body with streaming eyes and motionless limbs to watch the result. At this instant, a fearful and tremendous yell ran through the air, and the car containing the mummy, which had been for some time entangled with the other balloons, fell to the ground with tremendous force, close to the expiring queen. The gigantic figure of Cheops started from it as it fell, his ghastly eyes glaring with unnatural luster upon the terrified courtiers, who ran screaming in agony in all directions, forgetting everything but the horrid vision before them. Chapter 12. The tumult had now nearly subsided. The late busy crowd had flown, uttering shrieks of horror and dismay, and of all the countless mass of human beings that had so lately thronged around, none now remained but Edmund and Father Morris, who supported Claudia, and the Duke and Henry Seymour, who still remained near the insensible form of Elvira, the eyes of all being chained, as though by magic, upon the horrid vision before them, whilst they, pale and immovable as the sculptured marble of the tomb, waited in fearful expectation of what was next to happen, and scarcely dared to move or breathe, the solemn silence that prevailed being only broken by the convulsive gasps of the expiring queen, an awful change from the busy hum of thousands which had so lately filled the air. "Where am I?" exclaimed Cheops, gazing wildly around, his deep sepulchral voice thrilling through every nerve. "Where is Arsinoe? Where is she? They seize her. They tear her from me. Curses on the wretches, may Typhon's everlasting vengeance pursue them with its fury, and may their hearts wither, gnawed by the never-dying snake." The mummy gnashed his teeth as he spoke, and the gloom that gathered on his dark brow grew black as night. All shuddered as that horrid glance of eternal hatred seemed to freeze their blood. They turned away involuntarily, and when they looked again, the spectre had disappeared. The shattered remains of the balloon lay before them, for happening to cross London just at the moment of the greatest confusion, it had become entangled in the crowd, and, notwithstanding the strong material of which it was composed, had been rent asunder in the scuffle, and had fallen with its fearful occupier to the ground. "Good God," cried Father Morris, after a short pause, "what a horrid vision! What can it mean?" "It seemed an Egyptian mummy," said Edmund, shuddering, "and it spoke that language. But what can have resuscitated it? What human power can have recalled to life, a being so long immured in the silent tomb? Perhaps the vehicle he came in may contain something to explain the mystery, said Henry Seymour. At this moment several persons ran past screaming with terror, and exclaiming that they had seen a demon. When the confusion excited by these trembling fugitives had a little subsided, a few of the courtiers began also to make their appearance, and returned to their posts near the Queen. But all were pale, and they started at every sound, seeming ready, at the least alarm, to take flight again as expeditiously as before. Claudia still lay insensible, her heaving chest and deep convulsive sobs for breath, alone betraying signs of life. But her fate no longer excited the deep, overwhelming interest it had done before. Whispers of wonder and superstitious horror mingled with the hopes and fears inspired by her danger, and her removal to the palace was almost regarded with indifference, so completely were the minds of men occupied by the strange spectacle they had so lately witnessed. Everyone, indeed, neither thought nor spoke of anything but the mummy, and 1,000 rumors, each more extravagant than the last, spread from mouth to mouth respecting it. Men stood in groups whispering to each other, and scarcely daring to stir without a companion, nay, even then, creeping from place to place, looking cautiously around, and starting at every noise, as though they feared the awful visitor was returned, whilst the sages of the country gravely shook their heads, and declared that what had taken place was evidently a visitation from heaven, in punishment of the sins of mankind. An indefinable presentiment of evil hung over the spirits of all. Gloom, indeed, spread through every class of society, all dreaded they knew not what, and all shrunk with horror from the thought of supernatural agency. There is an invincible feeling implanted by nature in the mind of man, which makes him shudder with disgust at anything that invades her laws. The body of the Queen being removed, attended by her physicians and the ladies of her household, the rest of the assembled courtiers gathered round the balloon, and exclamations of terror and surprise broke from their lips when they discovered it to be the same in which Edric and Dr. Entwerfen had so short a time before taken their departure for Egypt. The whole truth now seemed to flash upon them. "I thought how it would be," said Lord Maysworth. "You know I told you, Lord Gustavus, that in my opinion it was an expedition that could never possibly do any good, but you were of a different belief." "My lord," returned Lord Gustavus solemnly, "thinking as I think, and as I am convinced every one who hears me must think, or at least ought to think, it is my deliberate opinion, that the expedition of my youthful friend and his learned tutor was both admirably planned and well concocted, and that if it have failed in its ulterior object, it has been solely owing to some of those unforeseen events which sometimes do occur even in the best regulated arrangements, and which it was utterly impossible for any human ability entirely to ward off and avert." Edric's balloon. "Impossible," cried Sir Ambrose, rushing forward to ascertain the fact, and forgetting all his anger against his son in his anxiety for his fate. "Yes. Yes," continued he, looking at some of the things, as they were drawn forth and exhibited by different persons in the crowd. "Those were Edric's books, that was his desk. Oh! My son! My son! What is become of him?" Many sympathized with the unfortunate father, and more eagerly questioned each other as to the probable meaning of what they saw. No one, however, could give any explanation, and all was confusion and dismay. The bosom of Edmund, after the first moment of excitation had passed, was racked with anguish too bitter to allow him to feel curious even to know his brother's fate. But a few hours before, love and fortune seemed to unite in showering their choicest blessings upon his head, and now he was the most wretched of mankind, for if Claudia died, Rosabella or Elvira must be queen, and if Elvira should be chosen, all hopes of becoming her husband must be lost. "Oh, God," cried he, striking his forehead in agony, "why was I reserved for this? Why did I not perish fighting the battles of my country? And why was I saved only to be mocked with the hope of happiness, which, just as it seemed within my grasp, flies from me forever? Wretch that I am! Would that I had been never born, or at least had died in my nurse's arms, and thus escaped the tormenting pangs that now drive me to distraction." Whilst Edmund thus raved, the eye of Rosabella followed his every movement, and seemed with a fiend-like pleasure to exult in his agonies. I am avenged, thought she, he now feels what I have so often suffered. But this is not all, he must be probed to the quick ere he can know the bitter vengeance of a woman scorned. Whilst these violent emotions were convulsing the bosoms of all around, the old Duke knelt by the side of Elvira, gazing upon her with the most intense anxiety. Her gentle and feminine nature had been overpowered at seeing the blood of Claudia, and she still lay insensible, looking more exquisitely lovely than fancy can conceive. The beauty of Elvira was of the most soft and feminine description. Long silken eyelashes shaded her dark hazel eyes, and gave them an expression more voluptuous than brilliant, whilst nothing could exceed the delicacy of her complexion, or the beauty of her full rosy lips. The figure of Elvira might not have served as the model of a courageous heroine, but it would have suited admirably for an houri, and lovely as she always was, she had perhaps never looked more so than at this moment, as the returning blood softly retinted her cheeks, and her eyes gradually unclosed. Lord Edmund gazed upon her, till, maddened by the thought that he must lose her forever, he could no longer endure his own sensations, and, darting amongst the crowd, he endeavoured to fly from the world and from himself. The Duke, on the contrary, saw the recovery of his daughter with unalloyed transport, for though he loved Edmund, and wished to have him for a son-in-law, he was by no means insensible to the prospect of seeing his daughter a queen, and his breast throbbed with violent emotions, which had long been a stranger to it. In the meantime the mummy had stalked solemnly through the city, urged more by instinct than design, the mist that still clung over him, making him seem like one wandering in a dream. Yet still he advanced, his path, like that of a destroying angel, spreading consternation as he went, and all he met flying horror-stricken from his sight. Many, however, when the monster had passed, crept softly back to gaze after him, and amongst this number was Mrs. Montague, in whose breast curiosity, that vice of low minds, reigned predominant. The whole family had reached home in perfect safety, the lady herself hurrying her return, the moment the accident of the Queen was made known, lest, as she said, in the confusion that might ensue, her servants might be induced to leave her house, and some evil-disposed personages might strip it of its contents. Urged by this prudent motive, Mrs. Montague had hastened home, and finding all safe, was just about to retire to rearrange her disordered dress, when one of the servants rushed into the room with the account of a fearful spirit having been seen in the Strand, whose mysterious appearance, coupled with the singular accident that had happened to the Queen, seemed to portend some dreadful calamity that was about to fall upon the country. "What is it like?" asked Mrs. Montague. "Have you seen it, Evelina?" "Oh yes, cried the panting girl, its eyes flare like fire, and it stares so wildly round it. And as it went along it saw a dead cat lying in the street, and it knelt down and took the creature up, and kissed it, and lamented over it in such a strange way, and in such a strange language. I never heard anything like it in my life." "Oh, dear! I should like to see it," cried Mrs. Montague, flying to the door, and holding it half open to secure a retreat in case of necessity. Just as she reached the street, however, fate, as though willing to gratify her curiosity, occasioned the mummy to turn back, and with that kind of half-pleasure and half-pain, with which the good people of England sometimes delight to gaze upon anything horrible, Mrs. Montague continued to look as it rapidly approached her dwelling, till, as it reached the door, to her infinite horror it stalked towards it. Awestruck and trembling, Mrs. Montague retreated. The mummy followed her. He stretched his hand out to her. She shrunk back aghast from his touch. "Lead on," cried he with a voice of thunder. Mrs. Montague could bear no more, and she fled screaming to the parlour, where her husband was already lost in some of his beloved calculations. Absent as Mr. Montague generally was, however, he was roused by this unexpected intrusion, and the blood ran chilly through his veins, as he saw the tall majestic figure of Cheops stride across the apartment. His athletic stature, his dark swarthy complexion, and his strongly marked features, aided by the fearful lustre of his piercing eyes, gave to his figure, swathed as it yet was in the vestments of the grave, a supernatural grandeur that thrilled through every nerve of Mr. Montague's frame, and he shrunk back with horror as his fearful guest stalked past him. Cheops saw his terror, and smiled in proud disdain as he threw himself upon a couch, placed near a window looking upon the garden, which, as we have before stated, shelved down to the river. There he lay, his eyes fixed upon the majestic Thames, whilst Mr. and Mrs. Montague gazed with trembling limbs and pallid lips at their strange guest, without daring either to approach or disturb him. "Thus have I watched the Nile," said Cheops, his awful voice sounding as from the tomb, "whilst the gently rising waters have gradually swelled into the flood which was to pour joy and plenty over the land, and thus, too, have I lain, gazing upon its streams, when, the purpose of all bounteous nature having been fulfilled, it has sunk back, slowly retiring to its natural bed. But, oh! How different were the feelings that then throbbed in my breast, to the corroding fire that now consumes me, oh! Osiris! What horrid thoughts flash through my brain, they come like overwhelming floods pouring from heaven to the great deep, sweeping all before them in one mighty ruin. Oh! Arsino! By the fell rites of Typhon, there's madness in the thought." Then springing from the couch, his eyes glared with yet fiercer brilliancy as he flashed them round, whilst Mr. and Mrs. Montague, terrified beyond the power of expression, flew towards the door, eyeing the motions of their dangerous guest with feelings of unspeakable horror. The storm of passions in the breast of Cheops, however, though tremendous, seemed soon allayed, for ere many moments had elapsed, he sank again upon the couch in a kind of lethargy, which, if it were not slumber, seemed at least to imply a temporary cessation from pain. "Thank God," whispered Mr. Montague, as he motioned to his wife to creep out of the apartment. She tremblingly obeyed, and the moment she thought herself in safety, she threw herself upon her knees, and thanked God with more fervour than she had ever done before in her whole life, whilst the servants, who were all assembled in the anteroom, crowded round her, trembling and with pallid cheeks and white lips, clustering together like bees swarming round their queen. "Oh, madam! Madam," exclaimed Angelina, in a whisper, "what will become of us? A serous moisture transudes from every pore in my body with the chilliness of death, and my very hair erects itself with horror upon my head. And my heart throbs with such violence," said Cecilia, "that the whole arterial system seems deranged." "It is evidently an Egyptian mummy," observed Mr. Montague, and, as he seldom spoke, every word he uttered was listened to as an oracle. "Its language and its dress bespeak its origin, but by what strange event it has been resuscitated." At this moment a sharp knock at the door made the terrified servants all spring closer together, clinging to each other in an agony of nervous horror, and not one daring to approach the door. The knocking and ringing, however, at length became so violent as to rouse even Mr. Montague to give the clamorous intruders entrance. It was Father Maurice and Sir Ambrose. "Oh, my dear brother," cried the latter, panting for breath, "have you heard the news? The strangest vision has appeared, and the Queen is certainly dying. Everyone says it is a demon." "What, the mummy?" asked Mr. Montague. "Have you heard of it then?" said Sir Ambrose eagerly. "It is now in this house," cried Mrs. Montague. "In this house," repeated her brother-in-law, whilst Father Maurice, who had looked pale and exhausted when he entered the hall, became still paler, and looked scarcely able to support himself. "To arms!" cried Cheops from the inner room, "the Pali are upon us. Cowards that we are, the enemy are at our gates." Screaming, and scarcely knowing where they went, the terrified servants tumbled over each other in the hastiness of their retreat, huddling themselves together in a heap, yet keeping their eyes fixed upon the door from which they expected the spectre to appear, as though charmed by the fascination of a rattlesnake. A loud crash now produced a fresh scream, then all was still. After a long pause, which seemed of endless duration, Father Maurice, evidently with a dreadful effort, roused himself and advanced. Death itself is not so horrid as this suspense, said he, as he resolutely threw open the door of the room, which had contained the mummy, and entered it. It was empty, but the broken framework of the window seemed to point out in what manner the awful visitor had made his exit. It was with infinite difficulty that Mrs. Montague could be persuaded to return to the room, and when she did, the remainder of the day was passed by her, and every inhabitant of her mansion, in fear and trembling. When they spoke, it was in whispers, and when they moved, they crept along with stealthy noiseless steps, as though they feared the echo of their own footsteps, the eyes of all fixed timidly upon the broken window, through which the fearful stranger had disappeared. Slowly and heavily the hours rolled on, till the time appointed for dinner arrived, the servants, as they served the meal, looking timidly around, instead of regarding the dishes they carried in their hands, and the family scarcely daring to eat, and only speaking in whispers, whilst they started every moment, fancying the wild eyes of Cheops again glared upon them, and his deep hollow voice again rang in their ears, and their own tones sounded strangely hoarse and unnatural. Nothing, however, had terrified Mrs. Montague so much as the laugh of Cheops, strange, wild, and unearthly. It still seemed to ring in her ears like the yell of a demon, whilst, if anything that happened chanced to recall the appalling sound, her limbs shook in every joint, her teeth chattered in her head, terror blanched her lips and cheeks to a ghastly paleness, and she seemed every instant upon the point of rising from her seat and flying shrieking from the room. In the meantime, the sensations these extraordinary events had created amongst the people were indescribable. Strange rumors and contradictory reports were circulated, and the most incredible stories invented of all that had passed. The minds of men became bewildered, they knew not what to credit nor what to think, a gloomy presentiment hung over them, they seemed to feel some fearful change was at hand, but scarcely knew what to hope or what to fear. Business was at a stand, people indeed gathered together in the shops, but it was only to whisper secretly to each other, strange mysterious stories of the late marvelous events, which they dared not breathe in public. The extremes of ignorance and civilization tend alike to produce credulity, and the wildest and most improbable stories were as greedily swallowed by the most enlightened people in the world, as they could have been even by a horde of uncultivated barbarians. The family of Mr. Montague retired early to rest at the close of the eventful day we have been speaking of, hoping to lose in sleep the remembrance of the harassing events they had so lately witnessed. Lord Edmund had returned soon after the disappearance of the mummy, but he had locked himself in his chamber, and had refused to see anyone, his mind being too much agitated for him to endure the common forms of society. All was soon quiet throughout the mansion. It was midnight when a tall figure wrapped in a large cloak appeared slowly gliding with cat-like steps through the garden of Mr. Montague. It cautiously avoided the light, and crept along the shadiest walks and thickest alleys, carefully shrouding itself from observation, and endeavoring, by availing itself of the shelter of the trees, the better to conceal its movements. It has been already stated that the garden of Mr. Montague was only separated from that of the Duke by a terrace very little used. The door, indeed, leading to it from Mr. Montague's premises, had been so long closed up as to be nearly forgotten, and yet it was towards this unfrequented spot that the mysterious figure directed its course. The long neglected door slowly opened, and the stream of light it admitted was obscured for a moment by a passing shade, and then all seemed dark, silent, and mysterious as before. "It certainly went that way," said a voice, the preciseness of which marked it as belonging to Abelard, and it was a real, tangible, material form, as I saw its shadow intercept the light when the door was opened and it passed through. "It is quite impossible," cried Evelina, one of Mrs. Montague's housemaids, who having been induced by the inconstant butler to take a ramble with him by moonlight, had also witnessed this strange apparition. "You must be mistaken, Mr. Abelard, for that door has not been opened this age. It is even nailed up, as you may see yourself if you examine it." "It is very strange," said Abelard, after he had tried the door and found it immovable. "I certainly saw it open." "It must have been an optical delusion, Mr. Abelard," said Evelina. "The retina of the eye is sometimes strangely affected, and represents objects quite different to what they really are." I must consult Father Morris about it tomorrow, resumed the butler, for it was certainly the mummy spectre. La! Do you think so, Mr. Abelard? Said Evelina, turning pale. Why then didn't you speak to it? I will if it comes again, returned Abelard. Oh! There it is, cried Evelina, and the worthy pair flew back to the house, screaming in concert, and without once daring to look behind them. Scarcely, however, had the last echo of their footsteps died away upon the ear, when the figure emerged from the recess in which it had lain concealed, and again crept slowly towards the door leading into the garden of the Duke. Hist! Marianne, cried he, pausing for a reply, but all was still. Marianne, repeated he still louder, fools! Dolts! Idiots, continued he, stamping violently, as he still found his call of no avail, they have kept me so long with their cursed folly, that she is gone. Eternal misery haunt them for their officious babbling. By heaven! If they had had the sense to climb the wall, I had been lost, but hark, she comes. The door now slowly opened, and a female figure holding a light appeared. How is she? Cried the stranger. Better, returned the female. Then it is past the power of man to kill her, resumed the first, and rushing wildly past her he buried himself in the deepest recesses of the grove. Chapter 13. Father Morris, when Abelard and Evelina confessed to him the following morning the strange spectre they had witnessed, treated the whole as the mere vision of their heated imaginations, and refusing to listen to any of their surmises respecting it, prepared to attend the Queen, who, finding herself sufficiently recovered to be able to attend to the duties of religion, had, from the general reputation of his superior sanctity, sent for him to confess her. Her Majesty, indeed, seemed rapidly improving, and the hopes of Edmund reviving with her health, he passed every hour he could abstract from the duties of his station, at the feet of his adored Elvira, his love for whom seemed increased by the imminence of the danger he had just escaped, of losing her forever. In this manner several days had passed, and the strange visit of the mummy, and the accident of the Queen, had already taken their place on the shelf with the other events passés of the day, when one morning Sir Ambrose was startled by an earnest message from the Duke of Cornwall, entreating him to come to him without delay. Sir Ambrose immediately obeyed the summons, and found the Duke walking up and down his study in a state of the greatest agitation, which Father Morris was vainly endeavouring to tranquilize. "Oh, my beloved friend," exclaimed the Duke, springing forward and grasping the baronet's hand the moment he saw him approach, "my dear Sir Ambrose, Claudia is no more." "Dead!" cried Sir Ambrose, involuntarily looking at Father Morris, whose aspect, however, still preserved only its usual cold and statue-like appearance. "Are you sure that she is dead? I thought she was better." "So we all did," said the Duke, "but alas! We deceived ourselves, for Father Morris has just seen her expire." "Oh! Where is Edmund? Why is he not with you? What will become of him?" "It will destroy him to lose Elvira, and I, too, that have felt so proud in the expectation of his becoming my son-in-law. Oh, it will break my heart." "Oh," cried Father Murphy, who was also present, "and if that's the case, why don't you let Rosabella take the crown at once, and make no more fuss about it?" "And yet," continued the Duke, "I cannot bear that Elvira should be deprived of her right. She would so become a crown, and with her inflexible sense of justice, and desire for improvement, she would do so much good that I should not feel justified in depriving the country of such a sovereign." "Thus," said Father Morris, smiling, "do we deceive ourselves. You are ambitious whilst you think that you are only just. Believe me, if you consult Elvira's real happiness, you will not impose upon her the troublesome duties of a crown. She will make a better wife than a queen, for her gentle nature is less fitted to command than to obey. Rosabella has more firmness." "I do not agree with you, Father," said Sir Ambrose. "In my opinion Elvira is infinitely better fitted to be a queen than Rosabella, for her passions are more under the control of reason." "That is to say," resumed the monk, sneeringly, they have not yet been called into play. What do you mean, father? Began the Duke. Nothing that could give you offense, my lord, returned the priest. Disgusted myself with the world, I naturally thought the princess most likely to find happiness where I seek it myself, viz. in a life of quiet and retirement. Enough, said the Duke, but where is Edmund? Let us seek him, no doubt he is with Elvira, poor things. We must spoil their billing and cooing. Edmund was with Elvira, and was passionately urging his suit, whilst she, engaged with her embroidery frame, listened with a half-abstracted mind, and Emma duteously waited behind her chair. You do not love me, said he, or you could not answer with such provoking coldness. Indeed I do, Edmund, but you are so unreasonable. I have already told you I have no idea of that passionate overwhelming love you appear to feel. It absolutely terrifies me, and I am sure it is not natural to my character. This silk is too dark, Emma, and so, Edmund, if you feel you cannot be happy with such love as it is in my power to bestow, we had better determine at once to separate. Good God, exclaimed Edmund, striking his forehead violently with his clenched hand, how coldly you talk of our separation. What can I do? I try everything in my power to please you. Emma, give me my scissors. But since you will not hear reason. Reason, cried Edmund fiercely, seizing her arm, and then letting it go again. If you talk of reason you will drive me distracted. You quite terrify me with your violence, Edmund, said Elvira, rising, and preparing to quit the room. Oh stay! Stay, my adored Elvira, exclaimed Lord Edmund, throwing himself upon his knees and catching her hand, for heaven's sake, stay. Pardon my impetuosity, frown upon me, treat me with coldness, disdain, or contempt, but do not leave me. I do not know what you wish. I have repeatedly told you I am ready to become your wife whenever our parents think fit, and that I will do everything in my power to make you happy. Do you call that coldness? I do indeed, freezing, insulting coldness. Oh, Elvira! I would rather see you spurn me, hear you declare you hated me, or know that you doomed me to destruction, than hear you speak of our marriage in that calm, unvaried tone. How unreasonable you are, said Elvira, smiling. Hear him, Emma, is he not a singular being? And if I find it so difficult to please him now, what must I expect when I become his wife? Tormenting girl, exclaimed Edmund, you know your power but too well. What ridiculous creatures these lords of the creation are, said Elvira, playfully holding out her hand to Edmund, though she still affected to address Emma. I really don't think any of them know what they would have, and I believe the only way to manage them is to make oneself perfectly disagreeable. That you can never do, cried Edmund, rapturously kissing her hand. At this moment a slight tap at the door announced the arrival of the Duke and his friends. So, said the Duke, we have found you, have we? But you must take your leave of such tender scenes for the future. What do you mean? Asked Edmund. The Queen is dead, said Sir Ambrose. The glowing countenance of Edmund turned of a ghastly paleness, and his livid lips quivered, as he leaned against the window for support. Assist him, cried the Duke. He will faint. Don't distress yourself, Edmund, the death of Claudia shall make no alteration in your prospects. I am better, said Edmund faintly, attempting to smile, and waving off all assistance. 'Twas but for a moment, the suddenness of the shock overcame me. I thought the Queen was better. She was supposed so, returned the Duke, but it seems she had some internal malady her physicians were not aware of. An inward bruise, I believe. But don't make yourself unhappy about it, Edmund, I cannot bear to see you wretched. Let Rosabella take the crown, and think no more about it. Your Grace wrongs me, said Edmund, his fine countenance glowing with the exalted feelings of his soul. However I may suffer from the violence of my feelings, I can never permit them to interfere with my sense of duty. Elvira has a right to ascend the throne, and if my exertions can ensure her success, she shall be queen." "Thou art a brave lad," cried the Duke. "And will you really try to secure the election of Elvira, when you know, by so doing, you will deprive yourself of her forever?" "I shall do my duty," said Lord Edmund, pressing his lips firmly together, as though to suppress his feelings. Father Maurice looked at him from under his overshadowing cowl with a kind of sardonic smile, which seemed to say, "You speak well, but let us see how you will act." "My noble Edmund," murmured Sir Ambrose, tears rolling down his cheeks. Elvira's eyes thanked her lover for his disinterestedness, and the glow of anticipated triumph which flushed her cheeks betrayed that neither her love for Edmund, nor the grief for the loss of her cousin, could suppress her joy at the flattering prospect opened before her. "Elvira," said Lord Edmund, gazing upon her earnestly, as though he would penetrate the inmost recesses of her bosom, "what are your wishes? Do not hesitate to declare them, for alas! much hangs upon your words." Elvira blushed, and cast her eyes upon the ground. However, Lord Edmund comprehended but too well the meaning of her silence, and he sighed deeply. "It is enough," said he, in a mournful tone, "then the die is cast." He paused a few moments, whilst his friends, though they all looked at him with the deepest commiseration, respected his emotion too much to venture to interrupt it. Then rousing himself, he hastily brushed a tear from his eye, and exclaimed, "How weak is human nature! I know my duty, and I will perform it, but yet, O Elvira!" "Compose yourself, my beloved Edmund," said his father, "tomorrow you will be more calm." "Oh, talk not of tomorrow," replied Edmund, "today is the season for action. Keep the death of Claudia concealed a few hours, if possible. I will in the meantime assemble my friends. I know the army is devoted to me. A council of state will be chosen to direct the kingdom during the interregnum. I must be one of its members. Some weeks must elapse before the election can take place, I think." 3 months is the time fixed," said the Duke, "but you know the votes of all the people are to be collected, and that, with such a population as ours, will be no trifle. To be sure, it is the deputies that are to do the business, but then it will take some time to elect them. When the founder of the present dynasty ordained her successor should be chosen by the votes of the whole people," said Sir Ambrose, "she wisely recollected the difficulty that must arise from collecting their votes impartially, and directed they should elect deputies. But when she ordered that every 10,000 men throughout the kingdom should choose a deputy of their own rank and station to come to London to represent them, she did not calculate upon the immensity of our present population, nor think of the evils the presence of such a disorderly body of men must bring upon the capital. Yet any attempt to reduce their number would inevitably overturn the government," observed Father Maurice, "for as it is the only act of freedom the people have long been permitted to enjoy, they will be proportionably tenacious of it. And the majority of these deputies are to decide the election," said Edmund, musing, "then our business must be to secure that majority. Think you that any good can be done by endeavoring to procure the return of those who are disposed to be favorable to us?" "Very little," returned Father Maurice, to whom this observation was addressed, "for the lower classes, from their conceit and pedantry, are extremely difficult to manage. Their deputies, however, notwithstanding the ordinance of the Queen, will probably be more polished, and less learned, as the lower classes will be able to spare the time necessary to become deputies, whilst the country gentlemen will be delighted to obtain something to do." "We must be prompt," said the Duke, "at all events. I don't like delay." "True," replied Edmund, starting from a reverie into which he had fallen, "I must get myself nominated a member of the council, and we must arrange our other plans afterwards." The party now separated, and Elvira, left alone with her companion, indulged in dreams of future grandeur. "I am sorry for the death of Claudia," said she, "but I never loved her. She was so cold and uninteresting, such a mere matter-of-fact being, she had no soul, Emma, and how can one love a being so totally passionless and insipid? I wonder," continued she, after a short pause, What Henry Seymour will think of this?" Emma smiled. "Poor Lord Edmund," said she. "I know what you would say," returned Elvira. "I am sorry for him, and I admire his conduct extremely. There is really something very noble about him." Emma again smiled, for she saw, in spite of this admiration, that in a week poor Lord Edmund would be forgotten. In the meantime, poor Rosabella's mind was a prey to the most violent passions. A billet from Father Morris had informed her of the death of her cousin, and of the designs brooding against her interests. "I will be revenged," said she. "I will show them mine is not a soul to dwell upon impotent grief. I will assemble my friends. My father's party was strong in the state, it cannot be quite extinct. Let me see, to whom shall I apply? The Lords Noodle and Doodle, both of ancient families, were both devoted to your father, and were under great obligations to him when they were young," observed Marianne. "But they are such fools," said Rosabella. "They are well connected," returned her confidant, "and power does not always attend upon talent." "True, and, as they are so weak, I may guide them as I will." "Do not rely upon that. Folly is generally obstinate, and though there may be hopes of convincing a man of sense, fools will always have their own way." "How then are they to be dealt with?" "By letting them fancy they direct, when, in fact, they are directed. Apply to Lords Noodle and Doodle, as though for advice, more than assistance. Consult them how you ought to act, and suggest the advantages that will arise from your possessing the throne so artfully, that they may fancy what you say the dictates of their own minds, and then, if they advise any course, they in some measure pledge themselves to support you, if you pursue it. I do not doubt obtaining their sanction, and that of Lord Gustavus de Montfort, but I wish I could also obtain the countenance of Dr. Hardman, for he has many friends, and some talents," said Rosabella, "and I own I do not feel satisfied to trust myself entirely in the hands of any of the others." "Talk of liberty and public spirit," replied Marianne, "promise a redress of grievances, and a radical reform of all evils, and you may secure Dr. Hardman. Yet he is not a fool, nay, he is even shrewd, penetrating, and persevering, but as lunatics are generally mad only upon one subject, so even men of sense have generally some prevailing folly, and his is, that of being thought of importance in the state. Indeed, in my opinion, there are very few human beings that we may not make subservient to our views, if we have but penetration enough to discover their weak sides, and art enough to avail ourselves of the discovery. The world is very much obliged to you for the high opinion you have of it, returned Rosabella. However, I like your advice, and will pursue it. But do you think Father Morris will approve? Oh, I will answer for him, interrupted Marianne. I will then write to each of the 3 lords, continued Rosabella, and appoint a time and place for an interview with each. I must attend to the doctor afterwards. Beware, said Marianne, you have a difficult game to play. The old proverb says, it is well to have 2 strings to one's bow, but 4, I fear, will be too much for you to manage. Fear me not, cried her mistress, impetuous as I generally am, I can be cautious when I see occasion. In pursuance of her resolution, Rosabella wrote to the nobleman, whose assistance she wished to secure, and receiving favourable answers, the hour of 12 that night was fixed upon for a secret meeting between Lord Gustavus and herself upon the subject. The utmost secrecy was requisite, as Rosabella knew the fiery temper of her uncle, and felt confident that if he discovered her plans before they were ripe for execution, his vengeance would have no bounds. She wished, therefore, to ascertain her strength privately, and, as she was aware a fruitless struggle would only involve her in ruin, she resolved not to betray her intentions till there appeared at least a fair prospect of success. For this reason, when the Duke informed her of the death of the Queen, she affected only the surprise she might naturally be supposed to feel at the suddenness of the event, and appeared absorbed in grief for the loss of her cousin, without seeming even to think of the consequences likely to ensue to herself. In short, she acted her part so well, that the Duke was completely deceived, and when he returned to Sir Ambrose, after his conference with her, he exclaimed, "We had no occasion to alarm ourselves, or give ourselves so much trouble. I don't believe Rosabella even thinks about the throne, and I am sure she doesn't care a straw whether she has it or not. I am even confident, from what I have seen tonight, that I have only to express my wishes in favor of Elvira, to have her resign all pretensions immediately." Sir Ambrose smiled and shook his head incredulously, and the Duke was provoked, for, like all weak, obstinate men, he was extremely tenacious of the infallibility of his judgment. "Why do you shake your head?" said he. "Do you disbelieve my assertion?" "I do not disbelieve your assertion, I only doubt your penetration." "And why do you doubt that?" "Because I know Rosabella." "Then you think her indifference affected?" "I think it too great to be real. Moderation is not by any means a characteristic of Rosabella. She is ever in extremes, and when she appears otherwise, depend upon it she is only acting a part, and she has some end in view that she hopes to gain by it." "Well, let her be as sly as she will, she cannot deceive me. I'll watch her. I'll defy her to think, walk, look, or speak, without my knowing of it, and if I find she nourishes even the thought of rivaling Elvira, she shall quit my house immediately. I will encourage no vipers." Sir Ambrose smiled inwardly at the mistaken confidence of his friend in his own judgment. Thinking it useless, however, to irritate him by farther opposition, he endeavored to turn the conversation upon another subject. "It is strange," said he, "how frequently I have been thinking of that mummy. If there be no deception in the business, it is a perfect miracle." "And what deception can there be?" returned the Duke, peevishly. "You think yourself so very wise, and that you know so much better than other people, only because you are always suspecting something wrong. Now, for my part, I think, as poor Dr. Entwerfen used to say, incredulity is often as much the offspring of folly as credulity. I wonder what has become of the doctor and Edric. For, ill as Edric behaved, he is still my son, and I own I should like to know where he is." "Oh, I don't think you have the least occasion in the world to trouble yourself about him. Depend upon it, he and his mad friend, Dr. Entwerfen, are rambling about Egypt, and are happier now than ever they were before in their lives." "If you are right," said Sir Ambrose, "and they are now in Egypt, as they have lost their balloon, they may be even in want of necessaries." "And it is very right they should be so," replied the Duke. "What business had they to go away?" The hours of this eventful day rolled on heavily with Rosabella. The important consequences of the struggle she was about to engage in forcibly impressed her mind. Ruin must inevitably ensue if she failed, and even if she succeeded, her path seemed strewed with thorns. The anxiety natural to the intrigues she was about to be involved in, also hung about her. Though haughty and vindictive, Rosabella was not naturally deceitful. Indeed, the very violence and impetuosity of her passions rendered it difficult for her to appear otherwise than she really was. The secret intercourse, however, which, through the intervention of Marianne, she had long maintained with Father Maurice, had somewhat practiced her in concealment, but it was still repugnant to her nature. She was now anxiously expecting a visit from the Reverend Father, and as he was generally remarkably punctual to his appointments, his non-appearance filled her with a sensation of dread, and a presentiment of evil crept over her, that she tried in vain to overcome. "It is long past the hour the Father mentioned," said Marianne, after a long pause, during which she had been listening with the utmost attention to every sound. "I cannot imagine the cause of his absence. Surely our plans have not been discovered." And as she spoke, her blanched cheeks and livid lips betrayed the deep interest she took in his fate. "How gloomily that heavy bell clangs in my ear," said Rosabella. "It seems to ring the death knell of my hopes. A gloomy foreboding hangs upon my mind, and undefinable horrors rise in dim perspective before me." "Hark!" cried Marianne, her sense of hearing sharpened by anxiety. "He comes." Yes, he comes, added she, after a short pause, and in a few seconds Rosabella heard the father's well-known step. "You are very late," said she, as he entered the room. "Good God! What is the matter?" asked Marianne, as the haggard, agitated features of the priest met her eye. "You look like one who has held communion with infernal spirits." "You say right, Marianne," replied the father, in a deep hollow tone. "I have, indeed, conversed with spirits, for never could those fearful eyes that so long have glared upon me belong to mortal." "What do you mean?" asked Rosabella. "I have again seen the mummy. That fearful spectre from the tomb. I have even conversed with him, and he lives and breathes, nay even reasons, thinks, and speaks like a human being, but the sackcloths of the grave are still wrapped round him, his fearful eyes glare with unearthly luster, and his deep sepulchral voice thrills through every nerve." "What, that horrid creature whom we saw descend from above at the very moment of Claudia's accident? Heaven grant no horrible consequences may ensue from so awful an invasion of the general laws of nature," said Rosabella. "Are you certain it is no deception?" asked Marianne. "Deception," returned the priest, "even I trembled, Marianne, when I gazed upon the countenance of that tremendous being, and read there the traces of fierce and ungoverned passions, wild and destructive in their course as the raging whirlwind. Even I dreaded the influence he might exert upon our destinies, and shuddered at the thought of such a creature's being released from the fetters of the tomb, and sent back as a destroying spirit upon earth. The eternal gloom that hangs upon his brow seems to bespeak a fallen angel, for such is the deadly hate that must have animated the rebellious spirits when expelled from heaven. His look is terrific, and my blood froze in my veins at his horrid laugh, which seemed to ring in my ears like the mockery of fiends when they have involved a human being inextricably in their toils." "It may be a fiend," murmured Marianne, in a low whisper. At this moment, the clock struck 12. Rosabella started at the sound. "Lord Gustavus will expect me," cried she. "Go, then," replied the priest, with Marianne. "I will follow presently." With trembling limbs, beating heart, and all the trepidation which the consciousness of guilt cannot fail to give even to the firmest mind, Rosabella and Marianne proceeded to the terrace, where they found Lord Gustavus waiting to receive them. "You may think it strange, my lord," said the agitated princess, as she advanced, leaving her confidant at the gate which led from the garden, "that I should desire this meeting." By no means," said Lord Gustavus, condescendingly. "Indeed, I have already had some conversation with an emissary of yours, that has let me into your views, and I find from him your ideas upon several important subjects are so clear, so just, so sensible, and so accordant with my own, that I feel disposed to become your partisan, even before you utter a syllable." "And who is this emissary?" asked Rosabella, unable to account for a reception so unexpectedly gracious, and alarmed at what she feared a premature exposure of her plans. "Father Maurice," replied Lord Gustavus, alarmed in his turn, lest he should have unguardedly committed himself. "He told me he was an accredited agent of yours, and even induced me to. "Your lordship need not hesitate," returned Rosabella. "I was not aware that Father Maurice had seen you, or I should not have expressed surprise." "I have been induced then," said Lord Gustavus, "to bring with me 2 friends of mine, Lord Maysworth and Dr. Hardman. They are fully convinced of the justness of your ideas respecting retrenchment and reform, and they think your plans of curtailing the expenditure, by throwing all the power of the state into the hands of a few trustworthy individuals, upon whom you may thoroughly rely, such as them or myself, for instance, most excellent." Poor Rosabella was here completely puzzled, as she had not the slightest idea of what plan Lord Gustavus could possibly allude to, nor indeed was it probable she should, it being entirely the offspring of the creative brain of Father Maurice, invented by him solely for the purpose of the winning of the noble lords, to whom he had confided it, over to her party. Rosabella was naturally quick, and, possessing abundantly that very unexplainable, but well-known faculty, designated tact, she instantly divined the motive that had induced Father Morris to attribute this scheme to her, and determined to avoid, if possible, betraying her ignorance. Lord Maysworth and Dr. Hardman, who had remained at a little distance, and whom the agitation of Rosabella had prevented her before seeing, now advanced, and after having been presented to the princess, the former assured her of his devotion to her cause. "I admire your ideas exceedingly," said he, "and particularly your intention of removing Lord Edmund from the command of the army, and placing an older and more experienced person in his stead." "Lord Edmund," cried Rosabella, thrown off her guard by the sudden mention of that name. "Father Morris told me so," resumed Lord Maysworth, in surprise. "And he told you truly," interrupted Rosabella. "Father Morris is worthy of all the confidence I can repose in him, and, in fact, he knows my inmost thoughts, but I was not aware that he had seen you." A conversation now ensued, in the course of which Lord Maysworth detailed, with admirable minuteness, a variety of subjects calling for reform. Rosabella did not understand half he said, for his calculations bewildered her, and her mind, accustomed to soar with the eagle flight of genius, and take in oceans with a glance, could scarcely condescend to listen to the petty articles of economy in expenditure, to which it seemed principally his object to draw her attention. She assented, however, to all he said, and having let him speak as long as he liked, without showing symptoms of weariness, and having luckily said yes and no in the right places, he departed quite enchanted, and completely gained over to her party, declaring her to be, without exception, one of the most sensible young women he had ever conversed with in his life. To this, Lord Gustavus and Dr. Hardman assented, as she had appeared also to acquiesce in all they had said, and the noble lords and learned doctor departed perfectly satisfied. Scarcely were they gone, when Father Morris appeared. "My dear father," exclaimed Rosabella, enraptured at the result of the interview, "congratulate me. Lord Maysworth, Dr. Hardman, and Lord Gustavus, are our own." "I rejoice sincerely, my child," returned the priest, "for heaven knows I feel as great an interest in your welfare as in my own. But what did they say? Let us hear if your hopes are well-founded." "At first their expressions were rather of a negative nature, for they told me rather that a party existed against my rival, than for myself. They say the Duke has many enemies, from his obstinate and conceited disposition. They said also that my father had had many friends." "And do they exist no longer then, that you lay such emphasis on the word had?" asked Father Morris bitterly. "They exist, but it seems my father has been so unfortunate as to lose their friendship," returned Rosabella. "Lord Gustavus even alluded to some crime, which he said he had committed." "Crime? Did he dare to call it crime?" "He did indeed, and it is not possible to describe the torture that rent my bosom as he spoke. I always knew my father had been unfortunate, but I never before even suspected him of having been guilty." "Nor was he guilty, girl. None but fools or idiots dare breathe such an accusation against his name. 10,000 blessings on you for relieving my mind from the agony of believing him unworthy of my love. I am perfectly satisfied with your assurance, and yet, methinks, I would fain know his history." "Rosabella, you never knew your father. You were but 3 years old when circumstances occurred that urged him to commit a deed of desperation. Seek not to inquire farther, and endeavor, since misfortune has thrown a shade over your father's name, to redeem it by the luster of your own. As an obscure individual, whatever might be my will, power would be wanting. But it shall not be wanting. You shall be queen. I swear it, though all the powers of heaven and earth should unite to oppose my designs, and though even blood should be necessary to seal the compact." He was going on when a fiendish laugh rang in his ears, and, looking up, he beheld the gigantic form of Cheops standing over him. The bright moonbeams showed, with horrible distinctness, the strange attire, savage features, and unearthly gaze of the mummy, as his horrid laugh echoed from the wall behind them and pealed across the water. Rosabella had not before seen him, except when she knelt before the dying queen, and, shrieking with horror, she fled for refuge to her uncle's garden, whilst Cheops thus tauntingly addressed the priest. "You were conspiring mischief. Though the language your lips employed was unknown to me, that of your looks was clear. Men do not cast their eyes upon the earth, and murmur forth their accents as though they trembled at the sound of their own voices, when their purposes are such as will bear avowal. Make me your confidant, and by the aid of my serpent deity, my guardian Knef, I may assist you, but force me to become your enemy." And Typhon himself never pursued Isis and the infant Horus with more unrelenting vengeance than I will follow you and destroy your plans. Dreading alike to trust, or enrage this mysterious being, and cursing the evil chance that had led him to that spot, Father Maurice, who, like all the English in those days, was an universal linguist, found himself obliged partially to obey this injunction, and inform the mummy of his design. Cheops burst into one of his terrific laughs of derision. "And so," he said, "you would make yonder feeble girl who fled screaming at my approach, a queen. A fit monarch for a warlike people. Can a woman's arm resist an invasion of the Pali, or a woman's hands direct the reins of Mizraim's government? Alas! Alas! Where am I wandering? I forgot the change wrought in my destiny, and that your people seem powerless as the sovereign you would give them. Be satisfied, I will not betray thee. Indeed, so do I hate thy countrymen, that I shall rejoice to see thee triumph in deceiving them. Beware, however, how thou attemptest to deceive me, lest my vengeance, quick, sure, and unforeseen as the secret agency of the Apopti, should fall upon and crush thee at the very moment of the fruition of thy wishes." Fearing, whilst he hated the mysterious being thus strangely thrust into his most inmost secrets, Father Maurice promised obedience, and the mummy retreated within the walls of Mrs. Montague's garden. Ere he left the priest, however, he held out his hand to him. "Give me your hand," said he, "and let us seal our compact." Father Maurice shuddered as he obeyed, for the words of the mummy recalled those he had just employed, when this fearful apparition broke in upon him, and brought with them a train of thoughts he would now willingly have shaken off. He did not dare, however, to refuse, and reluctantly held out his hand. The mummy seized it with an iron grasp, and an icy chill seemed to creep from his hand to Father Maurice's heart, as he burst into one of his demon-like laughs and left him. Father Maurice, unable to shake off the horror that oppressed him, for he felt as though he had entered into a compact with a fiend, stood gazing at the supernatural appearance of Cheops as he stalked across the terrace. His gaunt figure, rendered more awful by the grave clothes that bound it, was magnified in the moonbeams, which seemed to increase, rather than to mitigate the unearthly ugliness of the apparition they shone upon. The priest was fixed in a fearful trance. In imagination, he still felt the cold and iron grasp of the mummy, whose eyes seemed as though they were still looking into his very soul, and whose solemn accents were even now scaring his faculties. At length, however, Father Maurice recovered something of his self-possession, and fled from the spot, he scarcely knew in what direction, under the fear, at every turning, of again encountering the dreaded mummy.